political money is essentially monetary extortion from the global south to the global north, or to the first world, right? If you're operating the International Monetary Fund, where your whole operation survives as a function of convincing the global south and developing countries that they are dependent on you for predatory funding and lending so that you can create more currency units, dump it onto the global south in exchange for their oil, for their labor, and for their natural resources, and import them, export them over to America and Europe and the West, like if that is your incentive, and there's tens of billions, hundreds of billions, perhaps even trillions or tens of trillions of present and future economic value in that, well then, of course, the prosperity in El Salvador is not as a result of Bitcoin and the volcano bonds and the lack of dependence on the IMF. It's a fluke. You know, the data is wrong.
Yeah.
Or this is wrong. Or people are making this wrong. Or it's a political thing. Or it's too much energy. Or it's not sustainable. Again, this is simply an incentive structure change, and it has a positive effect. And we'll instead try to push it over as something else, right? But I think people will learn. And I think as more people live in places like this, I think they'll see, right?
So Luke, I'm trying to remember the first time we met was in Miami, right? When we were on a panel together. Was that the first time that we met?
Correct. We were on a panel, you, me, Mark Moss. We were speaking in Miami.
Yeah, at the Thank God for Bitcoin side conference. Was that just last year?
No, that was this year, Mike. Gosh. Yeah. It's been a fast year.
Oh my gosh. There's been a lot of things have been happening. And is this your first time in El Salvador?
Correct. This is my first time here. Yep. I've been here 6 days and it's been a blast. I've loved it. So
I remember seeing your name kind of burst onto the scene. Well, obviously I'm not very good at time because I thought that, but it was just fairly recently, right? In the last couple of years was when you wrote that Twitter thread that went viral, or
this January.
It's just this. See, I told you I'm not very good at time. So.
No, it's all right. Yeah, it feels like multiple years.
So I remember, hearing that kind of create a little bit of buzz, and then I, obviously met you in Miami when we were doing the panel together. And so excited to delve into what it is that's driving you and why you feel like you're kind of making waves in the Bitcoin space and where you see us going from here. So first, what was it that I'm trying to even remember what the thread was that you had written? What was the topic that you were covering? And
it was this one we have pulled up here. Of course, first of all, thanks for having me down here. I appreciate it. One of the things that keeps me really passionate about this is seeing adoption in everywhere in the world, not just in America. And so being down here and meeting you and everyone else that's advancing this, those guys, it's great. So this is the thread that, as you say, kind of blew up back in January of this year. It's actually a funny story. It's a longer story. Most people actually haven't heard of it, but essentially, this was January 17th of this year, and I had made videos on Bitcoin before. I had done in-person talks before, trying to educate people about it, and typically be like a few people show up to this talk or 10 views on a video or whatever. And so I made a Twitter thread of literally the same message I had been talking about for over a year in person and on YouTube. But it blew up within 12 hours on Twitter. So I don't know what caused that, but I think perhaps a lot of it's the platform, or a lot of it was just the right timing. But anyway, so the basic idea of the thread here is that we have less in common with the future than the past, and technologically speaking. And that thought, I had that thought vaguely in my mind for a long time, but it really crystallized in that wording, that articulation for me in December of last year, 2022. I was on a trip to Israel, which thankfully was that year, not this year, but I was on a trip to Israel, and I was at Sea of Galilee, and not just Sea of Galilee, but throughout Israel. It was just amazing because there were numerous historical sites, obviously with Jewish significance, Christian significance, and a lot of these places had not changed in thousands of years, but had changed a lot since 1947 or since the founding of the current state of Israel, or modern technology. And so it was one of the thoughts. I had many hours to muse and think about things in life when there. But one of the thoughts that occurred to me at Sea of Galilee was like, oh, for since Jesus' time till today, or till very recent, it was visually the same, right? Nothing much had changed. And really only the last couple of decades we've been finding a lot of the artifacts. I got to see a lot of these artifacts that have been only found in the last couple of decades. And all this was kind of culminating in this thought of, well, man, more has changed in the last 50 years, or more has changed in the last 100 years than the 100 years before that, and before that, before that. And so then I simply ran the thought experiment in my mind. Well, okay, that seems pretty obvious. If we just extrapolate that forwards, it should, or at least to me, we should assume that that's just the continued trend, assuming that the world survives in the future. And so
that change is going to be more rapid and more consequential the further along we go. Yeah,
or even if it's not more rapid and consequential, even if it just keeps the same rate, that's still a tremendous amount of change. And so this chart that we're looking at visually here, the green line is the line of global energy production and consumption up to the past. So up to, you can see like a very rough timeline at the bottom there. So most of that is history of the last few thousand years. And then we can see that, 1700s starts to pick up, 1800s is like 5-10 times that, 1900s is like 5-10 times that. Now we're like triple that already. And so then basically my point here being that the total amount of energy that the world, our world population, is consuming and producing is just continuing to dwarf the last. And this isn't, this is when I really dove into the research of it, I was like, oh, okay, the Industrial Revolution is what kicked this off, right? But really it's not. Obviously it's a huge component, but even if you go back before the Industrial Revolution, it's like every century, every decade, it's just accelerating at a faster and faster pace. And so obviously this first thread, about the first half of it, actually doesn't even talk about Bitcoin. This isn't even a Bitcoin specific thread, but the thread eventually gets onto the points about Bitcoin and about how I think having the last 1,000 years, 500 years, whatever, depending how you define it, as political money, I think obviously we both argue that perhaps that's changing. Perhaps we have less in common with the money of the future, or the next 100 years, than the money of the past. So anyway, the larger point being that, just explaining like my optimism that. And
what are the other? What's the yellow dotted line and the red dotted line?
Yeah. Point being that it's not guaranteed. Obviously, things could slow down. They could regress. Obviously, and
those are other potential trajectories.
Yeah, and that's just a concept. That's obviously not a prediction. But point being that even if my larger point with having those is not to be a pessimist, but to say that our optimistic case, in my view, should be that we have less in common with the future than the past, and it's just completely against our current understanding of the world. Like, to me, that's the rational and the optimistic view, and that the only way at which the world we live in today in 2023 is anywhere remotely similar to the world 50 years from now is if something catastrophic has happened, right? At least that's my view. That either we're going to wildly progress into tech abundance and prosperity we can't imagine, and also the trade-offs and problems that could arise there, or we have to regress. I don't see any way at which the world as it is today continue, technologically speaking. So,
and for you, was it being there in Israel and having that kind of historical perspective that I believe since we were speaking together in the Thank God for Bitcoin conference, that Christianity is something that has an impact on your life, and we can go into that a little bit more later. But was that kind of clarifying for you, like to see in that realm that so much hadn't changed, even from stories we read about in the Bible versus I remember I did a study abroad program in university, which I'll date myself here, I think that was like in 97, so what's that, like more than 25 years ago. And part of that, we spent 3 weeks in Israel. I remember going on the Sea of Galilee, and they turned the motors off, and just kind of like sitting there and having thinking about the historical perspective of, the stories you read about in the Bible and their time on the Sea of Galilee. And as we were just kind of drifting there, it wasn't that different than it would have been for them. So was it that specifically that was clarifying for you? Or was this something that was already, you were thinking about a lot and it just happened to come together when you were in Israel, or what?
Yeah, I think, no, I wouldn't say it's the specific moment. I think similar to, for me with my general Bitcoin journey, let's say, I don't think there was like a specific moment where it's like, oh, okay, now I got it. I think most people could probably relate to that. I think most people, it's like a gradual, over the course of years, like a gradual step-by-step understanding. You could point to a few of the steps. So for me, that was definitely one of the more memorable moments, but I loved history for as far back as I can remember. I've always loved history. I've always loved philosophy. I've always loved thinking about causes and effects and why do things happen and what does this mean or how could we, and so having that background, and then also I have a storytelling, filmmaking, all that background. And so I think that was a huge part of it too. And then kind of like meshing all that together with my obvious growing conviction in Bitcoin, and then simultaneously being there and seeing, historical artifacts and places that were farther back anywhere, because I mean, obviously, here in the States, we go back 150 years, Europe goes back
that's so
1,000
old.
years, right? And then you go to Israel, it's like, oh yeah, this is 5,000 years. This is, 4,000, 3,500. It's like a whole nother layer, right? So anyway, I think it's a combination of those things. I wouldn't say it was that specifically, but.
How old are you?
I'm 24.
Okay. Wow, man, I'm old. I'm like twice your age, literally. That's, enjoy this period of your life.
Thank you.
I loved I still love my life now, but it's at that stage, before you have commitments and obligations, you can really do a lot. So make sure you lean into that.
Yeah. I mean, really, this thread, it went viral. Or to me, going from 10 views of YouTube, I had 84, I think. There's 80 to 90 Twitter followers when I posted this, and then it blew up overnight. It's 300,000 views. So for me, I was like, wow, okay, this is big. And then the second one I posted did even better. And so to your point, I was like, and I'm like, oh, okay, I guess this is what I do now, and I guess I should lean into this because I'm young, and it's just continuing to escalate faster and faster. And I can't believe 10 months later, less than 10 months or so. Now
you're getting invited to speak
with first Bitcoin circular economy in the world. Some of the pioneers here. So anyway, it's been a blast. Really loved it. So,
so what was the follow-up thread that you posted?
The follow-up thread was trying to quantify that. So basically, the idea of the first thread being like, okay, if we have less in common with the future than the past, if we assume there's more energy, prosperity, consumption, and production in the future, and we try to price that, how do we do that? And then the argument being that right now we have political money, where our technological problem is that we like using numbers instead of things for our way of communicating value. But the problem is that even though a number is better because it's more abstract than a barrel of oil or a brick of gold, you have to have central authority, which then brings about politics to control those numbers. So then the point being, if we then go from there and we try to have that outside of central control, decentralized Bitcoin, obviously, et cetera, then how do we try to price that future prosperity in terms of that? Yeah. And so that was the second thread. Then expanding off that, like, okay, if we try to number that out, so simply put, there's 8 billion people today. There's 5.3 billion adults. There's 21 million Bitcoin. Actually, there's less than that because we all know a bunch of them are lost, a bunch of them are hodled or whatever. You divide it out, and assuming just a simple even distribution, that's 262,000 sats per person. Right. But then obviously reality is not an equal average aggregate. There's Pareto distribution, power law, everything like that. So then 262,000 sats then suddenly is not it suddenly becomes extremely conservative if you then factor in power law and everything like that. And so then you just, for me, I would just keep going through that, and I just do my best to reason it out. And it's like, no matter how much I try to put my hyper bullishness in a jar, let's say, or like keep it in a can, it's like, no matter what, it just kept getting more and more absurd to me. And I think people also resonate with that, because then it's like, okay, there's 5 billion adults today, only a tenth of which have property rights. Like, it's taken us, again, less common with the future in the past 4,000 years to get to 500 million with property rights. What happens when we 10x this next century? And then you have theoretical AI and everything, obviously all that's even more mind-blowing. But
I think part of the reason people have such a hard time understanding Bitcoin, but then also they're so hung up on the energy component of Bitcoin mining, is they think that we will actually consume and produce less energy in the future. There was just in the expat in El Salvador Facebook page today, somebody had posted something. Who was somebody in the Bitcoin space was posting about, there was a quote about just how transformative it's been for El Salvador, how well that they are doing and how much it's benefiting the economy. And there was, a couple of people posting like, but now if El Salvador is using more resources, basically means like they're doing better, like they have more energy, there's less poverty. They're like, we can't have everybody, consume the amount of resources that the US and Europe do. It's not sustainable. And so actually this is a bad thing. And I'm just kind of laughing to myself, like these people have been saying this for hundreds and hundreds of years, these type of theories. And we keep showing that we figure out a way to produce more energy more efficiently. And like you said, the graph that you presented, like this is the most likely outcome, that we will continue in that direction. But I don't know, for some reason, people always want to be doomsday, like they want it. It's like they're wedded to this view that no, we have to like go back into the dark ages and, impoverish ourselves. Well, it's bizarre.
Well, I think, myself included, I think a lot of times, I think for a lot of people, they trend to either optimism or pessimism. And I think oftentimes pessimism is seen as the more rational way of thinking, right? It's like,
but if you look historically, it's never played out.
That's my point. That's why I price it in terms of energy and not human population or whatever, or GDP, because I think energy is the better, and perhaps even energy per capita is an even better way of thinking about it. But actually, I agree with that it's not sustainable. But the problem is that it's not sustainable in today's technology, right? I mean,
we always find a way.
We always find a way, like the entire globe could not house, I think it's 15 million. I don't know the specific number, but it's somewhere around 10, 15 million people on like a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Like the earth couldn't habit us because we would force every species to extinction, right? But it's like now we have cities 3 times that size. And so to your point, it's like, to me, I look back and it's like, okay, maybe the pessimistic outcome, perhaps that's even more likely, but then what do you do in that case? You can't invest in the money of that future. You can't invest in the assets of that because it's a pessimistic outcome. Like, to me, it seems either we invest and save for the future, assuming it's technologically going to be better, or worse. And if it's going to be worse, then the only investments to me that make sense are seeds, guns, and bullets. And so it's like, it's like
those are your alternatives.
So anything in the middle doesn't make sense.
That, like you just look at it, there's no historical reason to think it's not going to get better, that we're not going to innovate and figure out new ways to do things. Like we just always have. So it's really, you have to ignore all of history to think that we're going to go in the opposite direction. That's what always just blows me away by the people. And they get, especially a lot of people your age, like they don't want to have kids because they're so afraid, like, oh, I'm not going to bring kids into this world because it's going to like, the world's going to implode and we only have 7 years to lower the temperature. And you're just like, they've been saying these type of things for thousands of years. And here we are.
Yeah. And each problem we have becomes larger than the last. And so with the pessimism thing, I think that's why perhaps we trend to it, because every generation, the problems of that generation are larger than the last, right? Like right now, you just brought up the climate carbon thing. It's like, okay, sure, that plus, deforestation, overfishing, yada, 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 all these problems, plastic pollution, lead pollution, all these things are problems, and arguably bigger problems than the ozone problem of, its height a couple decades ago, but we more or less figured that out, and now that's trending in the right direction. And so, but then you go before that, and the problem before that was farming. There wasn't enough nitrogen in the early 20th century, and everyone was like, Earth's soil is going to run out of nitrogen, everyone's going to starve. Then Haber comes along, Fritz Haber process, more nitrogen, 4 billion more people, right? So it's like every environmental, every societal, every problem is bigger than the last. And anyway, I think.
So explain specifically where you feel Bitcoin's role comes into that type of outlook.
Well, I think the biggest economic problem, or one of the biggest economic problems of the last centuries, at least, perhaps even thousands of years, is what I alluded to earlier about how, okay, in the past we used to barter, your fish for my, milk or shoes or housing or farming, whatever, right? So we'd barter commodity to commodity or asset to asset. But then we're like, oh, okay, what is more fungible? What is more divisible? All the main qualities of money. What's better, all those things, than a physical thing? It's a number, right? But then, of course, the inherent technological problem with that is that if the whole society has distributed access to the numbers, well, my incentive is to just make more numbers out of thin air and give it to you for your stuff, right? I get to harvest your whatever for my seashells I just dig out of the ground, or my numbers I just make out of thin air, right? So inherently, if you're going to have a numerical monetary system, you have to have that centralized issuer, distributor, and management of the currency. And then, to what we were talking about earlier about how there are many steps that came for me personally to understanding Bitcoin. One of the major steps, not the sole one, but one of the major ones, was understanding that, oh, okay, this makes perfect sense in a Christian worldview, because if you're a Christian and you believe that all humans are sinful. Fall short, glory to God, et cetera, then you believe, oh, okay, if you have money that technologically requires the management of human beings, then it shouldn't be a surprise that inevitably 100% of the time, eventually a human being is going to get in that seat of power that's going to manipulate those numbers for their own benefit or their constituents' benefit. And so how Bitcoin comes into that is then, if we find a way to distribute those numbers without the need of that, then yes, a human being creates that initial monetary policy, but the inability to change it in the future is a massive implication, because for thousands of years, we've had constant inflation, since the Roman times, again, going back to Israel, since then, it's been constant prices go up, prices go up, prices go up. And that the prospect of having a monetary system, again, numerical based, without that central human control, well, now all of a sudden, for thousands of years in the past, prices have gone up. But now, what if we're at the point where prices begin to come down, right? I talk all the time online. In fact, it's my banner picture on my Twitter. I've never changed it, but it's the Jeff Booth quote: "Never price or never value a system from the system," right? And so, locomotive versus horse. It's like for thousands of years, we've used biological, mechanical energy, biological muscles, right, of a horse powered on hay to move us around. And then all of a sudden, it's like, for the first time, we have a non-living form of transportation, the locomotive, the steam engine, right, that's powered on water and coal and wood. It's just like, it's for people at the time, they thought it was insane. Even when there were trains around, they were moving around, it was just because it was too big, it was too expensive, like we were saying before, there's not enough this, that, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And to me, that's how Bitcoin fits into this, that for thousands of years, we've had to rely on political energy and information and management to keep the scarcity of those numbers as scarce as possible. But now we don't have to do that because we found a technological way around that, And to me, either it works or it doesn't, right? Yeah. Either the steam engine moves and it's going to be 10 times cheaper, faster, and better and safer than a horse, or it's not, and it's just going to sit there and be a useless hunk of metal, and your horse is going to be better forever. And so to me, that's like the whole epiphany with Bitcoin as a savings vehicle, an investment, both for me that got me on the orange pill route, but then also why I try to educate people about this is that either Bitcoin is stupid and worthless, or it's repricing everything. And most people are trying to take this locomotive puzzle piece and put it in a horse-sized shape, right? They're trying to fit it in, right? They're trying to fit in their portfolio theory, blah, 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 along with this and that and the other. And for now, that maybe makes sense, but long-term, it's like, it's either going one way or the other. You're not going to live in a half horse, half locomotive world. It's either going to be fully horse and the locomotive just is a fad that trends away, or it's going to be fully locomotive. And so anyway, that gets kind of this chart here. This isn't from that second thread, but it's related to that. This is not my chart. This is from the Twitter account with Smart Bitcoin, I believe. But yeah, this one didn't even vote. This one got like 500,000 views. But the point is that because we live in, because our lives are finite, our days are finite, the number of meals we eat is finite. We have linear thinking. But again, like you're saying, and I'm saying, with looking back in history, it's like it continues to be orders of magnitude. Yeah. And so with Bitcoin here, it's like, most of us look at Bitcoin on a linear chart. We see 13 years or 12 years of a flat line, and then 2 years of between 5,000 to 70,000 US dollars a coin. But if you look at the logarithmic view, you see it goes from, well, actually 2 years, there was no price, right? And then it goes from 1 cent to 10 cents to $1 and $32, and it crashes 95% to $2, and then it skyrockets and crashes, and each a new order of magnitude. And so then, if you just reason out in the future, there's an infinite number of what I call political currency units, aka fiat, aka by decree money, right? What we're talking about. And then if we only have a greater number of humans with a greater amount of energy abundance, then theoretically there's no, the long answer short being, I don't think there's a way to communicate the value from that future system, the previous system, right? If we go back again to Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, there's on the Sea of Galilee, for those that haven't been there, there's a little museum on the west side, I think, that has a extremely well preserved boat, like fishing boat from the time. And of course, part of the reason it's there is that, there's a legitimate probability that this is one of the fishing boats that Jesus or his disciples would have used in the time, right? And that's not saying they have any reason to believe that's the one, but you just theory it out. It's
an example of...
Well, yeah, you theory it out and like, okay, we know that at this period of time, there was only, a couple hundred fishing boats, and we, date this boat back to that time. And then it's like, oh, okay, there's like a reasonable chance, right? So my point being, how do you explain to Roman era fishermen on the Sea of Galilee a, cruise ship of today, right? Or even the Titanic. Like, how do you explain them to the Titanic? And then how do you explain to people from 1912 with the Titanic a modern day cruise ship with a VR headset, movie theater, casino, all like you can't, right? And so my point here is that in the same way you can't price a locomotive in terms of horses or Boeing 747 in terms of goats, I don't think we can price money that does not require human oversight, management, and manipulation to preserve. And I don't think we can. I think they're completely separate systems that we can't price in each other. So
going back to something you mentioned earlier, and just a worldview is like, if are humans inherently good or inherently sinful? And I think that's why we see a lot of divide between people in the Bitcoin space and people in the ETH world and the rest of the things, where I think they're... While I don't want Bitcoin to become a political party thing, I think there's a reason that it naturally aligns, because we believe that people are inherently sinful. And so if they have the levers of power, they will create more. And so that's why it's so important to have a cap, where I feel like a lot of people in the crypto space feel like, no, humans are inherently good. And so we want to be able to change. We want to be able to adapt, because who knows what the most efficient number of coins or what the inflation policy should be. So there really is a conflicting worldview at the core. That the press likes to put Bitcoin and crypto in the same sphere, but really in a lot of ways they're ideologically opposed to each other, because one view is we need this to be protected so it can't change, and the other is no, we want something that we can continue to make better and better. And so that's why I think there is so much infighting within the community.
And that quote unquote better and better, you just said that's better and better for me.
Yes.
That's better.
Well, but I think a lot of them would think like, no it's going to be better and better in general, but that's what it becomes.
Because their worldview, they have a specific desired outcome. And so they say, well, everyone else has this desired outcome, right? So this better and better for me, and we forget, oh, this isn't better and better for everyone else, right? And so I think it's a great point. And another one of those stepping stones that got me to Bitcoin is that, frankly, this might sound arrogant to say, but that humbling experience for me, and I think most Bitcoiners feel the same way, is that realizing, oh, if I was in control of Bitcoin would be worthless and stupid, right? It's like Bitcoin only works if I don't have control of it, right? Yep. Bitcoin only works if none of us in here have, Bitcoin only works if Michael Saylor doesn't have control of it, right? And so I think for a lot of Bitcoiners, I tell, a lot of Christians I know that do mission trips or whatever, that don't understand Bitcoin. Like, when they ask me about these trips where it's like, I tell them that more people ask me about, Jesus, religion, faith, philosophy, whatever. Obviously people have a wide variety of topics they like to bring up, but so many deep conversations arise in these networking events and in these conferences and online too. And I think a lot of that is that humbling experience of, oh, wow, for 20 years of my working career, I was pricing everything in my life, my time, my net worth, quote unquote, everything. I was my hourly worth or wage, all these things I was pricing in terms of political numbers. It's like, I didn't even realize that. What else am I missing? Yeah. And then they also realize, oh, wait, this new monetary thing that, this 747, we can't price in the goats, or this locomotive, we can't price in the horse. This thing only works if I'm willing to admit that no human being, including myself, has the power or the moral will, let's say, to have that position, right? I think for a lot of people, that experience of both having their entire economic, financial worldview undermined, and then on top of that personal moral admission that I think a lot of Bitcoiners go through, that just ignites so many other questions in places, that I think otherwise are easy to be overlooked or distracted away from, right? It really forces that. And so anyway, your point about the crypto tokens being different than Bitcoin, is I was having this conversation with a guy 2 nights ago. He's into a bunch of tokens or whatever, and like I had this conversation with him, explaining like, yeah, sure, maybe there's some cool utility tech, whatever there, but it's like fundamentally it can't do what Bitcoin does because there's a person that controls that, right? Ethereum has the whatever it's called, the Ethereum Foundation. And then you have Solana, where they can just turn it off or turn it back on. Then you have Sam Bankman-Fried's FTT token that obviously was not imploded and fraud.
Yeah.
And when that happened, I got so many messages like, "Oh, Luke, did you lose all your money?" It's like, no. First of all,
that's what's so frustrating is the media puts them all in the same bucket, even though they're like diametrically opposed. So any online magic internet money digital token system that's in the control of any board of human beings or human being, I think is going down to zero, and is worst case a scam and best case a high risk speculation for some utility that's eventually going to get sold out. But it's like all that is way different than Bitcoin. There's Bitcoin and everything Bitcoin
else.
Is the money. And I'm even willing to say that there will be innovations in the token space that will do things, that will provide certain value in that specific thing, but they will never work as money because people will be able to manipulate them.
And Bitcoin will absorb whatever utilities those have, right? Because Bitcoin, I try to explain to people too, is like, of course it's easier to innovate and scale and do whatever you want to do on some blockchain controlled by a single entity. Because all you have to do is go to that single entity and say, hey, this is a good idea. Will you do it? They give the stamp of approval and then they do it, right? But Bitcoin's very different because you have, the devs, you have the there's just so much more of a process to go through of convincing people and actually getting it through. So it's like, Bitcoin's dinosaur tech. It's like that's the whole point, right? It's like the internet. We have this up here right now. There's like at least a dozen devices in here connected to the internet. It's like everything uses the internet now, but there were many internets in the olden days. There was the TCP/IP that was decentralized. That was the one outside central control. And then there was everything else that were different internets made by different people or organizations. But the one that was decentralized, that's what won out. And I think in the same way as, I'm definitely not the first, but many others have described in the past about how Bitcoin's a TCP/IP of money, or that Bitcoin is the internet version of money, whatever. It's like, it's the same thing. The same way that what the internet did to communication was made it global, made it instant, made it basically permissionless and outside the control of any person.
And people said the same thing about TCP, that like it's inefficient, it's not going to work. That it's.
I don't remember. I'm too young, but anyway. But so that.
I think too, going back to what you're saying, what I've seen, because I have the same experience. A lot of people come to me and have questions about faith and ask me for recommendations on books. And I think Bitcoin also, because of the time preference issue, when you lower your time preference, you start thinking about eternal things. And so I think that's why we also see, I think, a growing number of people in the Bitcoin space that are interested in what is, in re-examining faith.
No, that's a great point about time preference. I'm for those that are listening audibly, I just pulled out a $100 bill, right? And so I always carry these on me because it's like for me, it's a reminder, but then it's also a great tool about how it's like, this is 100 American monetary currency units, and this is like 100 Venezuelan ones. And so, what's so heartbreaking about going places for me, and I'm sure for you and a lot of the Christian missionaries in the Bitcoin space, Jimmy Song, I was with him in LA, and because he just did a trip to like 30 countries, and this is what he talked about, that people living in places like this with political currencies, fiat currencies with longer time preferences, let's say, for the American dollar, it takes 10 years for it to lose half its value, right? But for dozens of countries around the world, I think it's 33 or 35. I think it's 33. Other countries in the world, their fiat currencies are down at least 50% against the dollar in the last 10 years, right? So if the dollar's lost half its value in the last 10 years, and all these other fiat currencies have lost at least half their value in the last 10 years. I think 4 of which are G20 countries. To your point, time preference just gets destroyed, right? I mean, I often say online about how the problem with political money fundamentally is that we continue to harvest prosperity gains from the future to consume them in the present to service our debt until the point at which there's no future, right? And so this is ultimately backed by a barrel of a gun.
Yeah.
If I'm printing numbers, distributing them to you, centralizing more and more, this continues until either you run out of stuff for me to steal or you no longer trust my numbers, right? So either hyperinflation or war, right? And so anyway, your whole point about time preference is I experience the same thing. People are like, for the first time, I'm thinking about my kids. I'm thinking about my grandkids. I mean, obviously sometimes people think about them, but it's like, I'm actually saving for them. I'm actually building a business. I want them to hear I'm doing this and that, whatever. It's not just about me saving more money to all blow in my retirement or whatever, or not even that, just spend a day, right? I think that gets in so much, and perhaps this transitions very well to El Salvador, but I'm amazed. I've been here 6 days now. I've been traveling a whole lot. I've actually not even climbed a volcano or surfed. I realized that this morning. It's like, I've been out with Salvador 6 days. I'm not surfed. I'm not climbed a volcano. I've not even done a podcast. I'm like, what am I doing? Right. But anyway, I've been so busy traveling. And despite all the cities I've been in, I've not seen a single homeless person. I've not seen any like evidence or things or like drugs or anything like that. And like, I've been very fortunate and blessed to travel a lot this year with thanks to all this Bitcoin stuff. It was like, Boston, LA, Miami, Toronto, on and on and on. And, Ohio and Michigan, Indiana, all through there. It's like every place I've gone besides El Salvador, even Guatemala City. I was in Guatemala City back in February, and this has been the only place I've not seen that.
And it's definitely, it exists. So,
I know.
I know people be like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. It definitely exists, but I understand what you're saying.
It definitely exists, but genuinely, I'd rather be, if I had to pick a city for me to like walk around at night, like I genuinely pick San Salvador 100%. Over Boston, LA, or Toronto. It's just,
when I go to Miami for the conference, I'm like, and I'm not like a person who gets scared, but I'm like, man, I'm not used to having to like look behind my back as I'm walking down the street. Yeah. So I get what you're saying.
Yeah, that to me, that all goes to time preference, and that all goes to the general more heart of the nation. Let's say, I think people here, obviously Bitcoin adoption is nowhere near 100% or even 5% or 10%. Most people are not using Bitcoin, so that's not what I'm claiming, but it's amazing how, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, but everywhere I've gone, that's been the thing I've not seen any of, that very sad and horrible stuff, but I've seen a lot of people talking about, wow, the roads are so much better than they were a year ago, or this is so much better than it was, 2 years ago, or Bukele is so great, or this is great. And I think it's like having so many people, even if it's not all the people in this country, it's like so many of them actually think 2 years from now is going to be better. But it's like anywhere in America I go, people are like, things are going to get worse all next election cycle. Biden this or Trump that or Democrats this or immigration that or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, obviously there's a lot of problems there, but anywhere in America go, they have some sort of, whether it's political, moral, they have some reason to believe that things are worse now than they were in the good old days and that the future is going to be worse from their present.
Yeah.
It's just like two different collective mindsets.
And that wasn't, I've been here for 20 years and that was never the case here. In fact, it was one of the most depressing places where people felt that the only hope they had was to escape to the US, usually illegally, live apart from their family and send money home, or the other route was to join the gangs. And so there was this sense of it was just going to keep getting worse. And I don't want to overstate the impact that the Bitcoin adoption has had. There's obviously, a lot of different things that have come into this, but it has played a role. And it's, I think, too, just representative of the mindset that the leadership here and the president has of thinking longer term, of understanding how important it is to get the money right for everything else to follow suit. And so I think 99% of people vastly underestimate all the second and third order impacts of adopting Bitcoin that have had here. Even for people who don't use Bitcoin, their lives have improved vastly because of the ripple effects that it's had.
Yeah, definitely. I think I often talk about how, it's not the numbers that matter. It's not the numbers that we actually care about. It's the stuff that the numbers bias that we care about, right? And I think it's the same thing with what you're saying, is that it's not the Bitcoin that's important, but it's the emergent collective behavior of society, the mental state of everyone. Like, that's what matters. And I think Bitcoin is a really important, right now, really small, but really important part of that here. And obviously, what do I know? You've been here 20 years, I've been here 6 days, but but I think it's true. And I was genuinely very, very surprised when I saw that, because, I figured like, oh, Bitcoiners just hype it up, they want to promote tourism and all that. But like, being here, I'm like, holy cow, this is real.
People are excited.
Yeah,
and a lot of them, most of them don't know that it has anything to do with Bitcoin, but they have this general sense that like, hey, things are getting better. And I think we underestimate how important narrative and just people, whether they're optimistic or pessimistic, how important that is for development. Because pessimistic people do not invest in their communities. They do not think about the future. They do not build for the future, but optimistic people do. And so I think just that shift in mindset is the majority of the reason things have turned around here so quickly.
Yeah. That gets back to the optimism versus pessimism that we were talking about earlier, I think, because, well, I think I said it earlier about how I think most of us believe the pessimistic answer is oftentimes a more rational one. And perhaps if your worldview is pessimism and everyone else's worldview in your society is pessimism, perhaps it is the more rational one. It's like if you've been trained, on political money that has to deteriorate year after year in order to service credit markets and the corruption and distortions of money that the issuers of currency create. Like, if that has gotten worse every single year, and we condition our brains and condition our worldviews, our companies and cultures to think that our money is inherently going to be worth less every year, well then, and then obviously the second order effects there. Well then, yeah, maybe that's a huge part of what you're saying earlier about why it's so hard for us to understand why people are so pessimistic on everything, because it's like, that's what they've experienced. Yeah. That's all they know. Or that's, even if they can't put their finger on it. I think oftentimes that's the more dangerous thing. It's not the things you believe you could put your finger on. It's the things that you don't even realize you believe, right? So anyway.
Well, I think so many people, like the vast majority of people, don't realize how negatively their lives have been impacted by the fiat system. Like, I came to Bitcoin because I understood how much I've benefited from the fiat system. Like, I learned at a young age how to game it, how to be on the receiving end. And over time, you start to realize just how unfair that is, because other people pay a price for it. But most people don't even realize that that's happening. And so people always say, oh, you're in the Bitcoin because you want to get rich. It's like, no, I was doing quite well in the fiat system, but I just saw how unfair it was, and how, employees, different people that worked for me, like, they were always going to be in this continual state of just survival, because you really had to understand how the system worked in order to benefit from it. Where with Bitcoin, it's just a fair system where everybody is kind of levels the playing field.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I think I would add to that about the whole getting rich thing, because I hear that all the time too. Oh, you're just in Bitcoin to get rich. I often don't know what to say to that, because it's like, yes, I do want to get rich from being in Bitcoin, but it's like, it's a totally different mindset.
Yeah.
Because in fiat getting rich, it's like, okay, I want to make as many numbers as possible. I mean, it's like, even this chart here, it's going Bitcoin from 1 cent to $1 to $10,000 to $100 million to $1 trillion. I mean, so like, obviously getting rich is a part of it. A lot of my content online, frankly, the content that always does best has big fiat number, Bitcoin to $1 million or $100 million. That's always what does best, right? And it's like, yes, you got to bring people in that way. But to me, it's
so we'll have to title this episode that Luke predicts Bitcoin's hitting $1 trillion.
Yeah. I mean, it will eventually, in terms of this, right? But my larger point being that once you go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, you really understand that, oh, yes, I want to get rich, but the real richness is not in accumulating as many numbers as possible. It's about increasing exponentially the amount of energy production and consumption per capita as possible for me and everyone else.
Yes.
Right. Because right now in America, this was, so at the Adopting Bitcoin conference where we are, this was my whole talk, right? I guess now I'm getting into that. But my point being that, like, as you're saying with American dollars, like, we're closer to the money printer, the money managers in DC than people here in El Salvador. They also use these dollars, but because we're closer to it, we're the victims, right? The banks are the victims from the central banks, and then the people that borrow from the banks are the victims of the bank. But then the perpetrators are the people behind them, right?
Yeah.
And so likewise, I'm a victim of the banks, central banks, and lobbyists dumping their numbers onto me, my political currency units onto me. But then I come here and labor's 10 times cheaper and housing's 5 times cheaper. And this is, like for me, I benefit at their expense, right? And so I think a lot of the people that look at Bitcoin are like, oh, you just want to be in Bitcoin to get rich. They have perhaps a lot of times to not their knowledge, which is perhaps why Bitcoin is very offensive to people, but that zero-sum thinking, that pessimistic thinking. But if you're thinking from the Bitcoin worldview, it's like, yes, I'm in Bitcoin to get rich, $1 trillion of Bitcoin, right? But that only happens if everyone else benefits. Like Bitcoin's value only goes up if we have more energy, if we have a larger population, if we have more prosperity for me and for everyone else. That's the only way in which Bitcoin's price goes up. I only get richer in Bitcoin if everyone in El Salvador also benefits, right? But with fiat, that could happen too. And I argue that does happen technologically speaking, but with political currency distorting that, the faster way to get rich is to print numbers faster and give it to them to receive more raw materials, labor, and resources from them until eventually, like I said, there's either nothing left from El Salvador to plunder and steal, or they no longer trust the numbers, right? Hyperinflation and war. So anyway, I think, this was my larger point being that what's cool about Bitcoin is it aligns on incentives that I think right now a lot of us view getting rich and helping others as separate. And in many cases, they are separate. In many ways, they are the same. Fiat obviously separates those. But with Bitcoin, to me, the beauty is that, I can come here and network and work and have vacation and do all these things, right? And it's better for me. It's better for the locals. It's better for everyone else. And ultimately, like the only way I increase my purchasing power in the future is if I increase the probability of others also increasing their purchasing power in the future.
I think in El Salvador too, it's a great example for people because they use the US dollar. You can explain that when the US just conjures up money out of thin air and gives it to Americans, it is robbing from people in El Salvador. They're devaluing the dollars are here. And really because the globe is so dollarized, it's robbing people from around the world. And so it's for them to see that now when they, especially during COVID, it was insane. The amount of money that they just gave away.
Stimmy checks, right?
Pushed. But even beyond the stimmy checks, I mean, I have a small business and, we were shut down during that time, but at the same, so I'm like, oh, our business destroyed. But then the government just started like throwing money at all these different programs. And I'm like, they were benefiting us, but I'm like, this is insane. This is so unfair that if you fit in one category, they're going to fund this. And I mean, I know lots of people that made more money than they ever had in their lives, and during COVID without working, because it was, if you got into the right government program and were the right thing, it was just insane. But the Salvadorans, that was money directly coming out of them and loss of purchasing power. And not just El Salvador, because, as I mentioned before, the dollar really is a global currency. So it's sucking value from the poorest around the world for the benefit of people like myself. And so when people say like, oh, you want Bitcoin because it benefits you, it's like, no, I want Bitcoin because I know I unfairly benefit from the current system.
Yeah. The bigger the stimmy check, the more El Salvadorans suffer, right?
Yeah.
And that I think that's, again, offensive to people. And, myself, formerly, I'm sure it would have been, because it's like, what do you mean it's theft? The government's giving me, $600, $1,200, whatever dollars. Like, they're giving me money. Why am I stealing from them? It's like, well, because you're also being stolen from, and so you don't see it, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is such a good point, because I think oftentimes, one of the big misunderstandings of Bitcoin is that, oh, we're rational optimists. I think we've talked about that a good bit with you just want to get rich, or, oh, Bitcoin uses too much energy. But I think another one of those is that, oh, it's a conspiracy, or oh, you think the government's going to collapse. Oh, you think it's like a new elite world order, blah, blah. It's like they think we're conspiracy theorists, and a lot of us are. but
it's hard not to be these days. They're doing such crazy things that there's no other explanation.
Yeah. Especially once you go down the Snowden, Ross, like all those. But that aside, conspiracy speculations aside, it's like fundamentally Bitcoiners, I think, are some of the least conspiratorial, fundamentally first principles speaking, right? In that, like this, I'm not describing political currency as a political problem, right? Like this is, in my opinion, and this is why all my threads, I focus on the technological side, because I think this is fundamentally a technological problem, right? I don't think this is a Republican, Democrat, this person, that person, this collective, that collective, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's the fundamental problem, right? I don't even think the government's the problem. If we wiped the slate clean, got rid of Congress, the Fed, the whole American governmental system, and I set it up, right? Or you set it up, or the Bitcoin, even if we did that, it still wouldn't work, right? Because and again, this gets to the whole crypto thing. It's like, it doesn't, in my view, it doesn't matter who's in control. It doesn't matter how they're in control. If there's some loophole or button to push where you either have control or you can potentially gain control in the future, then it's a failure, right? And I think, this whole thing of, oh, the government's stealing from you, it's inflation and blah, blah, blah. I think to a lot of people, again, in that zero-sum fiat mindset, interpret that as, oh, this person's a conspiracy theorist, right? But to me, it's just a technological problem that if you're going to have that, inherently, it's going to be exploited, right? Why does France get to control, the money of half a dozen African nations? Why does America get to control the money of, half a dozen Latin American nations and more indirectly the rest of the world, right? It's like, why do these things happen? In my opinion, because we're living, this is the point of my first thread, we're living in the ancient world today of 2123, 100 years from today, right? Like people in 100 years will look back at us, I think, and be like, wow, those people, can you imagine how they lived? I mean, in the same way that we can look back at the Romans from 2,000 years ago, it's like, wow, they had to spend 10 hours a day farming, and they had to make their cheese this way and their olive oil that way. And a 5-mile journey was a 3-day trip or whatever. And you had to do this and that. It's like, it's a completely different world, that we fundamentally don't understand. Frankly, most people probably can't even, start a fire or, know what to do with a herd of goats, right? So it's like the world they're living in 2,000 years ago and the world we're living in is technologically completely different. And fundamentally with Bitcoin, and I think why Bitcoin attracts so many different political worldviews and philosophical, religious worldviews is because of that unifying component that, oh, the problem is not which group of people is in control of the money lever. The problem is that the money lever exists at all, right? And so if Bitcoin is that, well, then I think people 100 years from today will be looking back at today and like, can you believe that people would spend numbers that another human could just make out of thin air? And can you believe that they did this and they had that? I mean, I think it'll be, I think the next couple decades, it'll be very difficult to help people understand Bitcoin. And I think after that, it'll be very difficult to have people explain why people didn't use Bitcoin.
Yes.
Right?
Well, it's just the things like the common belief, even among the very educated, that 2% inflation is healthy, that we need this 2%. We've been gaslighted into this belief that, no, it's good to devalue the money. And there's just, if you just look at it, at the very basic facts, like this supposed healthy inflation is stealing 2%. It's not just that 2%, because that causes the value of assets to go up. It causes you to have to pay more taxes on everything. Even if in real terms you're not making any money, you still owe money because in dollar terms you have additional gains. So there's all these different ways that it allows government to grow, that if people knew this was the real cost of this system, they would rebel against it. And so I think I think that's why the people who actually get Bitcoin, I think that Senator Warren gets Bitcoin. I think she understands. I do.
I don't think she does.
I think she does. But I think she knows that Bitcoin will take away the power they have to manipulate and hide all the things they want to do. Yeah. It'll take the money printer away for all the programs and the things. So I think she actually understands it, and that's why she's so against it, because she believes she knows better than anybody else and that she should control the lever.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think she gets it. I mean, I've watched a few interviews of her. You might have watched more of her than me, but I really don't think Liz Warren understands Bitcoin. You know, I just don't.
I don't.
And
Maybe not all the technical aspects, but I think she gets how dangerous for her if we can separate money from state.
Oh,
I
agree with that.
She gets that aspect, and she knows that that will absolutely decimate, you know, her view of how the world should work.
Yeah, but I don't think she understands. I agree she understands that separating money from state is a huge threat to the state. But I don't think she understands the inevitability of Bitcoin, because I think if she understood it, she wouldn't talk about it. You know, if I think of myself, if I was in a political chair, what would I do to destroy Bitcoin? The only thing I know personally I could do would be to ignore it, because the more attention you bring it, like Bitcoin, as we all call it, is like this black hole of value, attention. Yeah. And so it's like the more hate you throw at it, the better it does, right? I mean, you know, when China banned it in 2021, May or whatever, 2021, the hash rate fell, 60% in 2 weeks. Everyone thought Bitcoin was dead, yada, yada. But ironically, after that, what happened is that Bitcoin became more distributed, hash rates up like 4x or 2x or whatever since then, just a couple years later. So it's like, funnily enough, you know, same thing with the block size wars. You know, when people try to attack Bitcoin that way, all this negative press against Bitcoin, they threw all this negative press, millions of dollars, you know, all this attention against it. And it only made it stronger, made it go up in price, made hash rate go up. It's like, so anyway, yeah, I don't pretend. I'm not saying that I think she understands that, but I think she overestimates her own importance and the role that she can play, and she thinks that the state will ultimately prevail. But I think she gets how dangerous it will be to the current system, and so that's why I think she's, you know, leading the anti-crypto army. I don't think it has anything to do with crypto. I think it's specifically Bitcoin. That is what she's afraid of. Yeah, I think too, you know, and I get some criticism online for not being toxic enough, and maybe I should be more. You know, maybe I will be. I don't know. But right, I mean, one of the things I think about too is that I don't think all of these people, I think a lot of them are intentionally doing evil, knowing they're doing evil, but I think a lot of them too are just blinded.
Oh, they think they're doing good.
By thinking they're doing good, right?
They think they're the ones that understand how it should work.
Yeah. Because if I'm putting myself in their shoes, in their worldview, it's like, okay, if the entire world is based on my political money here, it's like, okay, if it's based on my political money that functions with debt and bonds, you know, and all that, and then we have this online stupid speculation that uses too much energy, doesn't do anything, because of course, why would it do anything? The locomotive has no use because we have the horse. Like the horse works for transportation, why do we need that, right? And so I think from their worldview, they look at Bitcoin and they're like, this is extremely expensive. It's using way too much energy. It has no use case, and it's sucking liquidity out of this that's causing increased risk to this system. It's like, of course, this is a huge threat, and we need to get rid of it. And it's this evil, bad thing. Like, I think they genuinely, from the worldview, don't see it that way. And I think because they see the direct, immediate negative consequences of their currency evaporating, you know, again, hyperinflation or war, those are the two outcomes, right? That because they see this is going to result in these bad things, they think that, oh, Bitcoin is bad. You know, and so that's the whole Titanic lifeboat metaphor.
But I think I think they believe they know better, and so they know
that's part of it too,
that the population would rebel if they understood how much they were actually paying in taxes. So they think it's for their own good that we obfuscate this so that they don't understand how much they're actually paying, because they're too stupid to realize that, you know, we know better. And I mean, we saw the same thing with COVID, and they came out later that they were literally, no, we can't tell them that this doesn't work, because then, you know, they might not actually get the vaccine. They might just, it was kind of like this paternalistic, well, for their own good, we have to hide what we're really doing. Yeah. But I think they ultimately think they're doing good in that.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
as many evil people do throughout history. Some of the biggest atrocities are people, they thought they were doing good.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I believe Hitler thought he was doing good. Like it was.
Yeah. Okay, so. we went there. No, but yeah, no, I agree with that. I actually think, you know, again, this is the Christian worldview. When a man's foundation is on his own belief structure and his own morality, as the Bible says, he will do right. he will do what is right in his own eyes.
Nice. Yeah.
Right. And so, Hitler thought us people were better. He probably, over the course of his lifetime thought, from his own understanding, his own background. I mean, you got to keep in mind, obviously not supporting of Hitler, but you have to keep in mind the amount of trauma and PTSD any man goes through in World War I, the trenches, the depression immediately after that, hyperinflation, again with destruction. I mean, everyone in Germany felt stolen from, they felt destroyed, they felt taken advantage of by their bankers and property owners, obviously the Jews, but then the rest of the world as well. I mean, obviously that's not a moral excuse, but they had, and frankly, I think we see that in people's personal lives too. In their own pain, they want to take vengeance out against the world, the system, the whatever. And I think we're seeing that in America. I think we're seeing that in other places in the West of people feel disenfranchised, people feel stolen from, people feel they've been taken advantage of, people feel hurt, they feel pain. And so we all do what's right in our own eyes. And we want to leverage that money creation lever. We want to leverage the tool, the most powerful tool we can think of to benefit us at the direct expense of someone else, right? So I think, at the nation state level, I think at individual level, there's just a lot of really deep stuff there. Yeah. So anyway, I'd love to talk about, going back to that technological, the PDF there, just because I think, justifying the case more for optimism and that, I'd love to, dive into that a little bit more. So this is life expectancy versus GDP per capita of the last few centuries here. And so going back to the point of, I only get rich if everyone else gets rich. I think this is true in a technological level. Like we're saying, if we look back into history, every century here, we see 1800, then 1950, 1980, and 2012. Every single one, both the poor and the rich get richer, and the poor actually get disproportionately richer faster than the rich, right? Like for me, being a, young American, obviously I'm nowhere near the top 1% of Americans, but being in America, I'm easily the top 5% of the world, right? So like for me, if I'm going to double my GDP, my energy consumption productivity, is like my life doesn't improve that much. I have no critical illnesses, I have plenty of food, I have shelter, I have clean water, so for me, if I double my wealth, yes, I get richer, but if the average El Salvadoran doubles their wealth, that might mean their kid can finally afford education. That means, so I think that's the beauty.
They can buy the medicine they need.
Or buy the medicine they need
to survive an illness that would have killed them.
Yeah, exactly,
otherwise.
Exactly. I think malaria is probably a great example of that. About how that's something really easy to solve, and extremely deadly throughout the world. But anyway, this goes. This is like data. Like we can talk about philosophy like this all we want, but this and hundreds of other examples really go to this directly. And like the next slide here is amount of total poverty or prosperity throughout history, right? So again, my whole musing of less than common the future in the past, for 1800 years, from 0 AD to 1820, 95% of the world was in absolute poverty, right? And now in the last 200 years, we have absolutely crushed that, absolutely destroyed that dramatically, to where now for thousands of years, the norm was almost everyone's poor and a few people are not poor, right? And now we're in this world where to them was unimaginable, where the majority of people are not poor and the minority are poor, right? And I think the same thing is true with reading. Before the printing press, 95% of the world did not read, small minority read, and now it's the vice versa. Almost everyone reads and very few people don't read. And I think, of course, going back to Bitcoin, for the vast majority of human history, the majority of people have not had property rights, to their land, company, stock, whatever. The vast majority of people have not had that unless they had a gun. And now, I think, again, I think we're still in the ancient world where 90% of people don't truly have property rights. But in the future, what if the majority do have property rights? And I think that's Bitcoin, right? And so anyway, like this just goes to the example of how I think the prosperity and the and also the problems too, because I want to mention that too. I mean, I'm not, maybe I'm irrational, but I'd like to think I'm not an irrational optimist, because I think there are problems today that we have that people in the past didn't have, right? Like we have more access to horrible things and destruction. I mean, obviously, nuclear weapons did not exist 200 years ago. Obviously, the internet has a lot of downsides. Obviously, the amount of drugs and alcohol. I mean, it's like
the opioid epidemic.
Yeah. So as we make more energy, it's not that we're inherently becoming more moral, I would argue. It's simply that we have a greater and more powerful tool to do whatever we find.
It's interesting though, because a lot of times, and I like to think rationally. That's just how I'm wired. So every time, that's what I'm bringing it back to. But I don't think that works for most people. And I think that's part of the problem Bitcoiners have, is we need to tell better life stories about how it changes things. I mean, we've seen this even with environmental things. Like if you just ask the average person, is there more deaths, per capita now because of environmental issues? 95% of them say, oh yes, we have much more, people dying because of environmental issues now than we had 100 years ago. When you look at the charts, it's like crazy how much safer the world is now, how many less deaths there are from, floods or earthquakes or all the things put together. But that's not what people believe. And so how do we take the facts that we know show one story and help people understand them in a way they can digest? Yeah. I'm asking you that as somebody who was doing stuff in film and somebody who has that vision, because that's the problem I have, because I like to argue facts, and I've realized like most people, that doesn't move the needle for them. Even if they're like, okay, I think he's right, they won't accept it because it doesn't touch them in the way that it needs to touch them. I ask myself that all the time. I think the best answer is meeting people where they are. And I think that's often done with stories, right? I mean, again, these political currencies here, you have the dollar and the Venezuelan bolivar, right? It's like, this to us Bitcoiners is like worthless, but most of the world using brainwash, that term, perhaps flippantly here, but most of the world is brainwashed to think that these things have value, right? And so it's like Bitcoiners are like, oh, blah, 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 you can't talk to people in terms of fiat price. But I think for most people, you have to meet them where they are and try to explain Bitcoin in terms of fiat price, right? So one of my best performing videos on YouTube goes into this, right? I talk about how, okay, there's 900 trillion of global financial assets. Forget derivatives, forget all that. 900 trillion of those assets, Bitcoin's market cap. You take the not theory, the reality that market cap's downstream of price. You reason it out like, okay, if 2% of real estate, bonds, stocks, and gold flow into Bitcoin. So most people decide they want a 2% allocation to Bitcoin. That's essentially what that means. Some people maybe want 4%. Some people maybe want 2 or 0%. Averages out 2%. You do that, you throw in Bank of America's multiplier of 118 to 1, you get a 10.725 quadrillion market cap, right? Like $500 million of Bitcoin, right? And so that's absurd and extremely difficult for people thinking in terms of this to understand, because you're telling me a magic internet Bitcoin money is going to $500 million. It's like, Luke, you're high, you're crazy, right? But then meeting people where they are there and then reasoning, oh, he's helping me try to understand the significance of digital scarcity and that we've never had digital scarcity before. Oh, wait, I was critiquing Luke saying that, oh, that only works if the dollar's worth less in the future. It's like, I get that comment all the time. And I'm like, bro, that's the point, right? That's the whole point I'm trying to make. It's like, but I think even despite those, but it's weird that silly people don't understand, because the facts are there. They can see that, we've lost 99% of the value in, I don't know, what's 100 years or whatever it's been. The dollar's lost 99.7% of its value in the last 100 years. Yeah. So it's like, that's what it's been doing. And we're just printing more and more, so it's gonna just go in that direction faster. Like it's but the facts are all there, but that doesn't seem to move the needle with a lot of people. Exactly. They won't hear those facts, but if I tell them the story of or the story and the claim, if people take on average a 2% allocation to Bitcoin and multiplier effect is conservative at 118 to 1, which it could be as high as 228 to 1 according to them again now, 2 years later, perhaps it's 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 future, so significantly more. But my point is that if I tell them the fact that the dollar's lost 99.7% of its value in the last 100 years, they're like, okay,
I'm not going to live 100 years. Why does it matter, right? But, or at least we think, right? You never know with technological advancements. But point being, people hear those facts. But if I, on a whiteboard or in a story or in a thread or in a video or a podcast, I tell them that story of technologies getting better and better. We have this fundamental technological failure of these monetary horses or upgrading to the locomotive. If I tell them the story and things that they can understand, because really that's how I came to understand it, right? It's not like I'm ascending down from heaven, bringing enlightenment to people. It's like I had to learn this too, also through stories and also through getting past my lack of logic reasoning, getting to my emotional, side of my brain, right? And I think that's where we meet people.
We didn't even touch on your Bitcoin story yet.
Yeah,
so
we haven't. Yeah.
I don't want to get you off track, but give us the short version.
No, I'll give you the short version. But I guess the last thing I want to say there about that, is again Jesus and the gospel. It's like, you could tell people about the Dead Sea Scrolls and this and that and the artifacts and this and that, but it's like at the end of the day, Jesus didn't come. The Jews wanted him to come as a political leader, right? Again, I think this perhaps had a big part of that. I think perhaps, our, love of money and love of earthly things is part of that too, obviously. But, it's like we wanted him to be the same. And he didn't come giving us facts and blah, 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 blah. All he did was tell stories, give parables, show miracles, all that. And that's what he did, right? And one of my favorite things that he ever said was that let those with ears hear, right? And I think it's the same thing with sharing the gospel today. I think it's the same thing with Bitcoin, right? It's like, and anything else that we're trying to share. I mean, but people...
And obviously you're not equating the Bitcoin with the gospel.
Obviously, which some do. But I think in anything that you're trying to encourage someone to go in the right direction, whether that's the gospel, whether that's Bitcoin, whether that's healthcare and health freedom, or that's quitting an addiction, obesity, drugs, smoking, whatever. Like in any way you're trying to advance someone in the right direction, it's like you have to have, and I think a lot of Bitcoiners need to hear this too, but it's like you can't bear that responsibility for their choices, right? Most people are going to cling on to this until it's worth nothing, right? I mean, most people don't escape a bank run financially. Solve it. It's not going to happen, right? And so I think Bitcoiners, I think anyone, including Bitcoiners, are trying to convince or orange pill others or red pill others in something they view as a better worldview. I think we have to divert to that statement that let those with ears hear, right? And the best we can do is try to meet people where they are, meet their pain points, ask them questions. Like I was asked this last night at a networking event. It was like, Luke, how do you do this so well? Or whatever. Like, well, I don't know if I do it well, first of all, but so much of it is just listening to people, I think, and hearing where they are, telling them a story that resonates with them, and a story that doesn't get them to do something blindly, but a story that causes them to think. And if they have ears, they will listen and they'll take action on it and we'll go from there. And if they don't, then they don't, which then I guess gets into my Bitcoin story. I didn't have ears. I didn't hear. I first heard of Bitcoin in 2016. I was told it was important. I was like, okay, whatever. I don't care. I'm going to school. I mean, I was young, I was a teenager, so I don't blame myself too hard, I guess. But I didn't hear, I didn't listen, I didn't consider it. I mean, there were a lot less resources, a lot less people telling that story, whatever. And then leap forward to 2019, I had a friend that I thought was pretty smart, and he told me he had a very high Bitcoin allocation. I was like, to me, that was kind of a humbling. It wasn't a specific moment, but that realization dawned on me that it's like, okay, wait, I thought this person was smart. And these other investor people I've heard that are into Bitcoin, Drunken Miller, it's like, I know they're probably smart. And I think Bitcoin is a scam at worst or a speculation at best, right? And I was like, I'm not going to figure out if it's a Ponzi scheme or just I don't even care enough to look into that. I just know it's not something I'll invest in. So I stuck with my mutual funds and whatever, blah, 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 right? And so then I realized, like, oh wait, these smart people are in Bitcoin, and I think it's a scam. It's like, okay, either these people are complete idiots, in which case I'm wrong for thinking they were not idiots and smart, or I'm wrong about Bitcoin. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, I better figure this out pretty quickly now, right? So this was like 2019 or fall, winter 2019. 2020, obviously March 2020 happened. A lot of things happened. We printed an absurd amount of money. I realized, oh my goodness, we just stole like a decade's worth of prosperity gains of financial freedom from 4 billion people to service the credit markets and solvency of the top 800 million people for the next 10 months. Like that's basically what we did, and I was like, that's a huge problem. And I looked at the bond market. I was like, oh, wait a minute. 98% of the nation states and empires that hit 130% sovereign debt to GDP, either hyperinflation, default, or war within 15 years. Oh, wait, we just hit that. That should be a red flag. Wait, why is nobody talking about this? It's like, that's a huge milestone. And actually, if we can go down a few slides here, down, one more, two more. Yeah, that one. Yeah, so this actually gets to that point was that, like I told you earlier, I've always loved history, for over a decade, like most of my life and childhood, I've loved history. And I realized, wait a second, March 2020 here, we just basically killed our bond market in many ways. We had 40 years of perpetually lower interest rates. We have pumped our bonds and our debt for half a century now in this economic prosperity. It's like, we have all these entitlements coming up. We have an aging demographics. We have rampant immigration, all these little check marks of former empires and nation states. And the big one being that 130% sovereign debt GDP, again, 98% of which have hyperinflation, default, or war within 15 years. And that's 3 years ago from now. I'm like, why is nobody talking about this? And because it fits in perfectly, again, with the story I tell myself about humanity, technology, yada, 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 is like, so this chart we're looking at here, on the y-axis, we have various empires and nation states. And on the x-axis, we have a timeline from 1000 BC to today and beyond today. And for those that can't see, what this is that all these black bars are the length of duration, the time that a given political currency, aka fiat reserve currency, has survived in the world. Now, the farther back in history you go, technically it's a little more fuzzy because the world's much more globalized today than it was then. So the idea of a global reserve currency kind of breaks down. But the long story short is that the length of time these reserve currencies survive gets shorter and shorter and shorter. I would argue this is predominantly because technology is, as we've been saying multiple times now, gets faster and faster and faster, right? And so, you look back, the Romans, it was 400 years. And, this colonial empire from a couple hundred years ago was 200 years or 100 years or, most of a century. We've gone from 10 lifetimes to now maybe 3 lifetimes. And then you get to the British before the dollar. Obviously, World War I, Depression, World War II changes that dramatically to the US being the favored one. We had the first globalized, trade system today, at least globalized in our worldview today. And I was like, oh, wait, my base case, and I'm thinking this in 2020 again for context, is like, I'm seeing in real time us print more numbers. I know this is theft. I know we're pillaging from the bottom 4 or 5 billion for the top, 0.8 billion. I know that's happening. I know it's a fact. I don't know why other people aren't talking about it, but I know it's a fact. And simultaneously, oh, wait, we're passing all these direct and indirect indicators of there being a serious problem in our bond markets and political currency functions on bonds. And then simultaneously, this fits with my story, my worldview perfectly of that the length of time reserve currencies is shrinking and shrinking. And actually, this is misleading. This is conservative because the top right black bar there of the US dollar says 100 years from 1920 to today. And that's actually misleading because we've had multiple monetary standards in American history. We had two, obviously before that black bar, we had two currencies in the United States that essentially hit hyperinflation, the Continental and the Confederate dollars. And then also we had, obviously Confederacy, you can argue if that's US or not. But point being, we've had multiple central banks in America. And then you had the Federal Reserve in 1914, you had Bretton Woods in 1944, then you had the Nixon gold shock in 71. So really, that black bar, you could probably have in multiple gray bars that the US dollar has had multiple eras of different reserve currencies. Yeah. And I think once people realize that, I've seen their eyes light up when they realize that, because they're like, yeah, but okay, maybe there's a new reserve currency, but the dollar's been around my whole lifetime. And I'm like, has it though? Because if you were born before 1971, you've lived in 2 monetary eras. If you were born before 1944, you've lived in 3 monetary eras. All 3 happen to be US, but the backing of those was entirely different. So anyway, my Bitcoin orange pilling story, this is 2020. I'm realizing these things. Of course, then there was the whole corruption and distortion in the medical fields with lockdowns /masks /vaccines. Obviously, there's a wide range of theories and facts there that we won't go into, but a lot of misinformation there, a lot of corruption, inherently obvious. And then simultaneously, you had the riots, you had everything else. And so 2020 was that big year where I realized, okay, I really need to take this seriously. 2019, like, okay, I know I'm probably wrong about this. 2020, like, okay, I know I need to figure this out. So I just spent time learning. Okay, proof of work, proof of stake, okay, difficulty adjustment, this, trying to get my head wrapped around it. And then one of those final mile markers, as I said earlier, was realizing the fundamental thing that's important to understand for me and then to communicate to others is not how crucial the difficulty adjustment is. It's not to communicate that there's 210,000 blocks in halving. Like, those aren't the things that are really important for me and others to understand. The thing that's really important is that if you have political money that's at the control of human beings, 100% of the time eventually will dissolve in the future. Maybe Bitcoin is not solved perpetually in the future, right? Maybe it fails, but it's surely a better outcome than this. We know fiat money created by human beings with political incentives eventually trends to zero or goes down 99.7%, and that's still the best fiat currency, right? So anyway, when I realized that heart of the issue, that the problem is technological, it's not political, and the problem is that humans are controlling this technology, and it's a technology that inherently requires human control, that's when I realized, oh, I need to really tell people about this. Because if for the next 40 years, we can 10x the number of people that have property rights. Again, 4,000 years to 500 million, 40 years, what if we could add another 5 billion? It's like, goodness, I want to be part of that, right? And so anyway, then I started talking about it, telling my family and friends about it. Of course, most of them think I'm either crazy or which understandably, right? Again, COVID happened. People on all political spectrums, all age groups, for all wide variety of reasons, delved into conspiracy theories, deep state theories, it's like people's worldviews really frayed out in 2020, and people took very extreme worldviews. And so probably hearing the young 23 or 22-year-old or whatever at the time talk about the American financial system's going to collapse, blah, blah, blah. You got to buy this magic internet money. Of course, it sounds crazy, right? And, 99 times out of 100, it is crazy, right? But I was like, I have to keep doing this because I think there's a real probability I'm right. And I think that particularly for people elsewhere in the world, like El Salvador, like the rest of Latin America, like Africa, like Southeast Asia, it's important for Americans to understand Bitcoin. But what gets me even more excited is seeing that 7 of the 10 fastest nations in the world adopting Bitcoin are places like this that are not America. Because, again, like we were saying earlier about how the wealthy do better at a slower rate than the poor, the inverse is true, right? If there is hyperinflation or war in America or elsewhere, the poor are always the one that starve, suffer, and undergo the most. Sorry, they have the lowest GDP decline on a nominal basis because they less in the first place.
But they're the ones whose day-to-day lives are actually impacted.
Precisely. And so that's really where I fully fledged as a orange shirt wearing, orange glasses wearing Bitcoin bro about, I need to advance this because it's not about the numbers. It's not about me getting rich, right? It's about doing everything I can, and not to make it about me, but everything all of us can do about increasing the probability of a smooth transition and lowering the probability as much as possible of a violent transition. And that's ultimately why I'm not very toxic online, is because that's my goal. Like, Bitcoin's going to win without me, without you. Like, Bitcoin doesn't need any of us. That's the whole point. But we know this trends to hyperinflation and war. And so anyway, that's kind of how this little mission of mine and all of us, I think, emerges. We realize, oh, this transition is going to happen. It's going to happen faster, very probably faster than the internet. Right now it's 80% faster than the internet. It's like, this is going to happen really fast. It's going to be really difficult for people to understand. It's going to be really offensive for people to take in. And it's probably going to have a lot of societal change. And then I took all these thoughts, made videos. No one cared. I made that Twitter thread, less account the future than the past. Technology is getting faster and faster. And it's more and more important as we go from a technological change taking 10 generations to 5 generations to 2 generations, like the last generation, and now less than 1 generation. And then, I met you in Miami, and then I came down here. So that's the longest story short. And it's exciting because hopefully it's just the beginning. It's such a thrill to hang out here and all that. So So yeah, I've got more charts if you want to look at those.
We can flip through the charts. I don't want to keep you too long. I know we have a Bitcoin meetup tonight.
We have a Bitcoin meetup.
But let's go through some of the more interesting ones, and then I want to make sure we talk a little bit about the movie project that you have and how people can get involved with that. So.
Yeah. So this chart here is the total.
I think this is important because I think people don't realize
really important.
That inflation didn't always exist in the dollar itself. It's been a more recent phenomenon.
Very, very recent. Again, this is why I try to frame things in thousands of years, not decades, because most of us live our lives in terms of decades and not centuries or millennia. And so I think we're conditioning, this is how it always is, right? Like if you were born today, you have a smartphone your whole life, the digital age is not normal, right? And likewise, I think we are easy to forget that people in the past, this inflation is not normal, right? So what we're looking at here is consumer price index United States from 1775 to I think 2009. So this is actually outdated by over a decade now. But this is cumulative inflation in America here. And as one that's looking at this chart can see, yes, it exists in the 18th.
We had deflationary periods where prices were going down.
Inflationary periods and deflationary periods. But then 1913, Federal Reserve, again, change of monetary era. We see it pick up. World War I, World War II, the Great Depression there. Then in 44, it's not included on here, but you can, if you really zoom in, you can see in 44, it increases again at an exponential rate. 1971, it increases again. Now, if you were to look at this, a hyper exponential rate perhaps. And then my argument would be, again, lessons common with future in the past, 99% of the dollars ever to be created are ahead of us, not behind us, right? I think people really don't think about that, right?
Yeah.
Bitcoin, there's less than 7%, like 93% of the Bitcoins or whatever, 93.5% of the Bitcoins have been created, right? So with Bitcoin, the majority of currency dilution, let's say, it's not really a term I would like to use there, but the currency issuance, that's perhaps a better one. The majority, 93%, is in the past. The dollar, 99% of all the dollars ever to be created 300 years ago to 20 years from today, they're ahead of us. And then all those 99% are ahead of us. So this chart, I think is just going to continue perpetually until these numbers are worthless. And this goes from being a live chart to instead a chart people tell their kids about in the history book. Yeah. So pretty brutal. And I think the next chart here also alludes to that too, and that the total amount of collective understanding of this. The term inflation was used, but it did not go hyperbolic until 1971. So this chart here is the occurrence of the term adjusted for inflation in Google Books, which is, obviously a collection of books that are digital or have been digitized. Yeah. And you can see going back from 1800 all the way to the early 2000s here, the term adjusted for inflation, this whole idea that we have to change the way at which we're valuing things is completely brand new, right? It's like, I often give the metaphor of length, about how, in America, because we're awesome, we have the best currency, and because we like to be the boss of everyone, we have, imperial, right? And so we have inches, ounces, gallons, whatever. But the rest of the world, metric, kilometers, meters, picometers, whatever, like in orders of magnitude. And the fundamental difference there is that in America, we base it on what we were basing it on, right? It's just something that we've basically made up. But the metric system is based on the speed of light, right? So a meter is 1/299 millionth and whatever. It's a specific fraction of the speed of light in 1 second, right? And so everything in the metric system in an order of magnitude up from meters to kilometers, or in the reverse down from meters to centimeters, millimeters, etc. It's all orders of magnitude based on a specific verifiable fraction of a universal constant in the universe, right? And so this is like saying, metaphorically, this is adjusted for the debasement of the gallon, or adjusted for the debasement of the inch or the foot, right? And so this is a very new occurrence. It's like we've gone from this world of metric to this world of imperial that's clearly an inferior measuring system, except we're talking economic value here, not length. So anyway, that's a part of it too. And so 2 slides down from here is a big part of when I was on Preston Pish's podcast. Oh, one up. Is about how, when you mentioned this earlier, that, and this is one of my concerns personally, is that Bitcoin really orients people's worldviews and their value hierarchies. And I think a lot of people view Bitcoin as divine, or view Satoshi as divine, or use Bitcoin as equivalent to the gospel, or subordinate to the gospel, or whatever. And a point I always make, because I think it's important for, the gospel message, but also because I think it's important for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Like, I think people don't understand, like, oh, you just talk about Jesus and Christianity because you're a Christian boy. It's like, yeah, that's true. But I think also is true for Bitcoin, because I think if we view Bitcoin as a divine thing, we actually perhaps are directly or indirectly more oblivious to the threats to it. And I think if we refocus Bitcoin as purely a tool, then I think, oh, okay, theoretically it could fail, and we need to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't fail, because the future is not guaranteed. I think we view it as divine, then we add risk to that. But anyway, the reasoning aside, the point is that I believe if we have corrupt money, then that leads to corrupt incentives. If we corrupt the incentives, we corrupt the society. The more we corrupt the society, therefore, the more we corrupt the incentives, and therefore the back we go to
corrupting this feedback loop.
Money. Yes, it's a feedback loop from the monetary system to the incentive structure to society as a whole. And I think that's what's so encouraging. That's one of my favorite things about being here in El Salvador, is seeing that as tiny as Bitcoin adoption is, maybe 80% here at Bitcoin Beach and like 1% in the rest of the country. Like, as tiny as that is, we're seeing second order effects in the incentives, and we're seeing third order effects in the society as a whole, which then both of those things reorient people's brains. They start thinking long term, which means they're probably more accepting of Bitcoin, accelerate Bitcoin adoption. So that's what's exciting about El Salvador, seeing that, to me, what's exciting is not seeing all the Bitcoin adoption. It's seeing that the Bitcoin adoption is making society, in my opinion, better. And therefore, that's going to accelerate Bitcoin adoption, because really that's what's important, right? It doesn't matter if Bitcoin adoption is at 100% and the society's worse, right?
Yeah.
So seeing this in the charts and the data, which we can scroll through if you want, but seeing that there had a click for me, and seeing it in person in America and the negative side, and in El Salvador and the positive side, really affirming and really exciting. I love it. So yeah, that's great.
And we saw, here kind of a variant of this with when the gangs became this kind of endemic part of society here, where because of the gangs, the people would flee and feel like they needed to go to the US to work, because they left, their kids were growing up without them around, their kids were more likely to join in the gangs, which meant more people were likely to have to leave because businesses would shut down because they're being extorted. So you had basically the opposite of what Bitcoin's done was what existed here before. And so I saw that firsthand, that cycle of destruction, that feedback loop. And Bitcoin has been able to come in and like break that, which has been so encouraging.
Yeah. That's fundamentally it. When I think of that, I think of the disparity between incentive towards productivity versus management. So a couple slides down here is a chart from America showing that incentive. So a couple more here. Couple more. That's Campbell's can of soup. That's funny. It's not the one I'm thinking of. So a couple more. Where is it? There it is. This is the one. Yeah. So this on the right here, we have, for those that are listening, we have 3 lines here. We have resources, financials, and others, right? And so in America, what we've seen is that since 1971, we have a dramatic monetary allocation away from increasing production and towards increasing management, financial management, asset management. And so, in El Salvador, like your example here, like fundamentally, what are the gangs? The gangs are a group of violent people that are controlling, manipulating resources, right? And so as productivity leaves the nation, as people flee the United States, as people leave the economic zone, then there's an increased incentive to not be productive and instead go to the cartels, which are violently managing resources, or the nation state, which is quote unquote non-violently managing those resources, right? And so the same thing is true in America, that as our currency deteriorates, there has been this increasing incentive away from industrial production and towards trading for the future or speculating. And I think, again, this comes all the way back down to people not understanding Bitcoin, because they look at Bitcoin. What is Bitcoin in their eyes? It's the ultimate speculation. People flip couches, or they flip watches, they flip houses, they flip cars. They're investing in speculating or gambling, right? Lotteries. It's not in this chart here, but if you were to throw in lottery tickets and gambling on aggregate as a whole, it's the same thing, right? That as our money degrades, there's an increased desire to speculate, short-term buck, and less to productivity, and increased incentive financial management, right? And so Bitcoin seems like the highest risk out on that bell curve of all things you could possibly speculate in. Surely houses are a better speculation than magic internet money. But once you get on the rabbit hole, you see that, in the same way that other things in reality and life are the complete polar opposite of our expectations. Bitcoin's like, oh wait, Bitcoin's not at the tail end of the risk curve of this speculation as a symptom of fiat, but it's actually the pin for the bubble. So anyway.
Well, I saw this as a business owner in the US and over the last several decades, how you became incentivized more because it was easier to make money from the government than it was from actually producing things. And so you'd see whole sectors, like the people actually making the most money were the ones who figured out how to get government contracts or government kickbacks or those sorts of things. So it was the same sort of thing. And the people that were actually being productive would go out of business because they couldn't make enough being productive.
Lockdown, that's the same thing.
Oh, 100%.
You're no longer incentive to create a productive business because you might get shut down. You're now incentive to get as close to the stimmy checks and the PPP loans as possibly can. And it's not like this big moral quandary people make. It's just what you do.
It's rational. You're just
you
like,
have
well,
to do it.
This is the most rational thing to do, so I'm going to do it, even though I know the outcome, like for society, is going to be worse. For me, it's going to be better. And so that's what we've seen in the U.S. happening, and that's why we're so unproductive now. I mean, we don't produce anything anymore.
I think that gets to our American arrogance as well about how, obviously, I would like to think most people don't think this directly, but I think a lot of Americans look at the poor nations, quote unquote, around the world, and they're like, oh, well, they must be lazy, right? Those Mexicans or those El Salvadorans, we worked for what we had or whatever. And it's like, it's true, we worked for it, but it's easy for us to look at them and say, oh, why do all these youth just keep going to the gangs and they just, flee here and bring their bad ideas to America and all that? And it's like, sure, there are lots of corrupt individuals that we shouldn't be letting in. But at the same time, it's like, I think in our American arrogance, we look at them and we fail to realize that they have the same incentive structure we do. It's just that we're on the better end.
Yeah, we're on the receiving end.
We're on the receiving end. Yeah. And so then we look at them, we're like, why did El Salvador collapse? And then likewise, I think in the same way we have that arrogance of like, we fail to understand why a developing nation can just descend in that madness. Now El Salvador is skyrocketing. I think I interviewed Max Kaiser and Stacy on the Adopting Bitcoin stage at the conference. I interviewed on stage, and one of the things, we asked was about immigration. And Max said, I don't know if this is true, but I'm assuming it is. Max talked about how El Salvador in America is about to become the first reverse immigration dynamic for America in history, where more people are leaving the United States to move to El Salvador than vice versa, because so many people are moving back. They're moving back to their families or back with their businesses or whatever. And I think in the same way, American arrogance is discrediting the developing nations for how much they've suffered. I think perhaps that's our downfall with failing to realize the dollar. That now we're failing to understand in the same way we failed to realize why they were suffering. Now they're skyrocketing. El Salvador's GDP is supposed to double in the next 5 years. Like I said, reverse immigration, all these other wonderful things. I come here, everyone talks about how the last 2 years, the country's completely changed. I'll go back home to the States and people probably won't believe me. And I get it, because it's like, it's hard to articulate that to people. And so, ultimately, I think when we talk about Bitcoin and Bitcoin adoption, I think most people will learn through pain. I think most of that pain will be monetary pain. I hope and pray that, again, hyperinflation and war are the two outcomes of this. I hope and pray we tilt towards hyperinflation and away from war. But I think ultimately it will be pain. And I think that, most people, as they learn that and they reorient the worldview, reorient the stories they tell themselves, they realize, oh, that this is better. And
the immigration thing has been, it's really been eye-opening to see how, and I don't think we're there yet. I think that in the near future we probably will see that, to have there more people coming into El Salvador than leaving. But for now, I think it's definitely still a net flow.
Yeah,
but
it's not there, right?
Yeah. It's slowed down drastically. And the funny thing is that is the primary role of the U.S. embassies specifically in Central America, is to stem illegal immigration to the U.S. Like, that is what they're tasked for. All their programs have been trying to do that. You listen to the commercials they put, on the radio, telling people not to leave here and not to try to go to the U.S. Like, they spend all this effort, and it's never had any impact. In fact, it just kept increasing. Now with Bitcoin adoption, along with the other changes that have come, illegal immigration, I think, has been cut in half for El Salvador, and wallets continue to go up for neighboring countries. So they're seeing this huge decrease that, they should be celebrating. But instead, because of Bitcoin, they're like all freaked out and they don't know how to handle it. They're like, oh, well, this actually looks really good, but we don't want to give credit to Bukele, and we surely don't want to give credit to Bitcoin. So they're kind of caught in this quandary now of how to deal with this positive outcome that they're seeing. So it's kind of funny, even talking to some of my friends that are at the embassy, they're like, they don't know how to deal with it.
It's like you're telling me that Bitcoin aligns incentives, and what's better for the El Salvadorans is better for us too. Wow, what a concept, right? That's exactly the point.
But instead, they're trying to push El Salvador off Bitcoin adoption. They're trying to, not directly because they know it looks bad if they're too overt about it, but they would like to see it fail here. And if it fails, they'll go back to the same immigration problems that they were having before. But it's so weird how they're so set on not giving credit to either Bukele or Bitcoin that they would rather see it go back to how bad it was before.
Yeah, we also see it with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. I don't remember the quote off the top of my head, but there's a quote from the International Monetary Fund from, I think, 10 years, 12 years ago or something, where it talks about how, basically the problems we're facing today, the best way is just debase, issue more bonds, all that, basically dilute the currency, right? If your liabilities are too high compared to your assets and your incomes, just dilute the currency. You're denominating everything in, do some fudge everything, make it better, right? Like the IMF, their whole goal, and this is a big part what Alex Gladstein talks about in his books and with the Human Rights Foundation, is about how political money is essentially monetary extortion from the global south to the global north, or to the first world, right? And so to your point about that is that there's a huge incentive, right? And you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. This gets what I was talking about before. It's like you don't have to believe these things that it's a room of men in dark suits and lizards and microchips and all. It's like you don't have to think all that. It's just a basic incentive. If you're operating the International Monetary Fund, where your whole operation survives as a function of convincing the global south and developing countries that they are dependent on you for predatory funding and lending so that you can create more currency units, dump it onto the global south in exchange for their oil, for their labor, and for their natural resources, and export them over to America and Europe and the West. Like, if that is your incentive, and there's tens of billions, hundreds of billions, perhaps even trillions or tens of trillions of present and future economic value in that, well then, of course, the prosperity in El Salvador is not as a result of Bitcoin and the volcano bonds and the lack of dependence on the IMF. It's a fluke. The data is wrong.
Yeah. Or
this is wrong. Or people are making this wrong. Or it's a political thing. Or it's too much energy. Or it's not sustainable. Right. So anyway, it just goes back to the same thing that I think, again, on the corporate level, that high view of IMF, US, ECB, BOJ, the big 3-letter organizations, right? And then also on the individual level, I think we'll all take this abundance we're seeing from Bitcoin adoption and we'll misattribute it to other things instead of understanding, again, that feedback loop idea. Again, this is simply an incentive structure change, and it has a positive effect. And we'll instead try to push it over as something else, right? But I think people will learn. And I think as more people live in places like this, I think they'll see, right? I mean, I talked to a lot of people here in El Salvador these few days about that aren't Bitcoiners, but, just trying to understand. Obviously, there's a language barrier too, but a lot of them speak English. And I met a lot of El Salvadorans that are like, yeah, I don't understand Bitcoin, or I have like $20 of Bitcoin, or like $100, they don't get it, which is fine, but they've heard about it and they've actually gotten off zero and they've actually bought, 10,000 or 100,000 sats, which I think is going to be a lot of money in the future. But it's like, that's totally different from America, where it's like either people are hardcore like me, or they just haven't even bought it to think it's a scam. Right. And so I think as more and more people live in an environment that's becoming Bitcoinized and has that positive feedback loop, that for many people is helping them see the pain economically in their own life and then making the jump and the transition. So, yeah.
I think as we get into the next upcycle, people are going to be shocked at the level of adoption in El Salvador because they're all prime. They have, everybody has, family members or friends that know how to set up wallets, that know all those things. Most of them have set up wallets themselves. So they're all ready. And once it kind of crystallized. And I'm not one to focus on price at all, but I do know it drives people, that's a lot of times what gets people interested. And so I think when they see that price move again, they're all prepared to jump in like all at the same time. And so I think I think people are very much underestimating the number of people that will move into Bitcoin during that time. And I actually don't know if we're ready for it. I think it's going to be
I talk about it all the time. All the time. I know, I know that you may not watch all my videos or whatever, but like in almost all my YouTube videos, all my articles, I'm always talking about how it's going to be so fast. I think it's going to be periods of incredibly rapid change and, perhaps years of stagnation. I think it's going to be so much faster than people understand, right? Again, the internet grew at an incredibly fast rate. We're 60% global adoption. It's like the internet with all these devices and everyone watching online, like this is 60% internet adoption. And at least half of that 60%, don't use the internet daily, like us in the West do. And so I'm like, people are like, oh yeah, Bitcoin might be a big deal when it's, at, globally adopted or whatever. But I'm like, Bitcoin at 10% adoption? Like if this is El Salvador, I don't know what you think the adoption rate here is in El Salvador, but if El Salvador is at like 1% adoption right now, I mean, it's like night and day. Yeah. Right. And obviously there's many factors there, but again, I think it's a feedback loop. And so I'm like, what does the world look like at 10% adoption? It's like, oh, the banks will fail when Bitcoin's at 100% adoption. I think it's like, no, what if the banks fail and everything goes under and hyperinflation at like 8% Bitcoin adoption, like 20%. I mean, I don't know. It's just a speculation, but it's what I think about. Like if 5% of American retirees become fully hardcore, crazy Bitcoin, orange shirt, glasses, orange pill, I'm going to El Salvador and buying land kind of folks. If 5% of American population did that, suck liquidity out of housing, gold, stocks, and bonds, I mean, that would be, I think tens of millions, not hundreds of millions of dollars a coin. I think people go crazy, everything, print to oblivion, and so I mean it's like the full Michael Saylor strategy. Saylor obviously is different than us. He's I don't know if he's been down here, and I don't know a lot of his worldviews, and obviously he has a million times more money than both of us. But it's like the same game theory. What he did was in 2020, like me, he realized I'm not comparing myself to Saylor, but I'm not. He figured it out before me. But like Saylor and like, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people in 2020 figured out, oh, this is a problem. In 8 months, he went from thinking Bitcoin was internet speculation, going to have the same result of internet gambling, which he tweeted in 2013, to then all of a sudden we're going to print as many stocks as we can, dilute our stocks as much as we can, raise as much capital as we can, buy as much Bitcoin as we can, just hold it for as long as we can. And it's like, to your point, what happens when that adoption does happen? What happens when more people figure that out? And we print the weak asset in perpetuity for the asset that's stronger. People think I talk about a 10 million, 100 million, whatever dollar Bitcoin because I'm this hyperbole or whatever. And yeah, I am. But at the same time, it's like, people like the freedom people feel here in El Salvador, I think is addicting. Like, I don't think it's ever going back. I asked Max Kaiser on stage the other day. Well, both him and Stacy, I asked them if they thought El Salvador was at escape velocity. And, I think the answer is yes. Because I think the people here, even though there's so much more work to be done, I think they've tasted the freedom after decades of civil war, gangs, and political corruption. I think they've tasted that. And I don't think they'll ever go back. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Where do you think Bitcoin adoption here in El Salvador is on a percentage basis? And do you think El Salvador's hit that cultural escape velocity, not just for Bitcoin, but in general?
So I think as far as the level of adoption, it depends like what you're measuring. Are you measuring like the percentage of your purchases that you're able to? So I'd say
I measure Bitcoin adoption, and I think you're right. There's different ways, but for me personally, just for context, I view Bitcoin adoption as they're pricing things in terms of Bitcoin. Right?
So pretty much nobody's pricing things in terms of Bitcoin. I mean, maybe land. I think what you see is higher value things of people that say, hey, I want to get this, many Bitcoin out of my land or vehicles. But we definitely don't see a lot of denomination in Bitcoin. I think that will actually be one of the last things to come. So I think at the highest level, we have the highest number of businesses. I mean, I think there's probably the percentage of businesses and their percentage of the GDP of El Salvador, I would probably say 20% of the GDP businesses, and that's a little bit distorted because like Super Selectos is the
Right.
the biggest supermarket chain. You can pay there. You can pay at PriceMart, which is the big wholesale retailer. Simons, which is the big department store, you can pay there. You can pay at McDonald's. You can pay at Starbucks. And so there's a lot of the bigger businesses. So I wouldn't say that 20% of overall businesses accept Bitcoin, but I would say 20% businesses that do 20% of the total volume. It might even be higher. It might be 40% of the total volume because most of the big businesses accept Bitcoin. As far as what percentage of people are actually doing daily life in Bitcoin, it's probably more like 1%. I mean, and that's going to be skewed by people like myself that, are doing everything in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So, bought vehicles in Bitcoin, have done. So and that's when people ask, it's like, where do you think acceptance at? It's like, well, it really depends how you look at it. Like in El Zonte, almost all the businesses accept Bitcoin.
Like at least 80%, right?
That's what I would say. I have heard
that was my guess. Is that what you guessed too? 80%?
That would be my guess. Somebody wrote something on Reddit the other day that they came to El Zonte and they were disappointed. They went all these places and nobody was accepting Bitcoin. I don't know. And it seemed like a genuine person. I don't think they had an agenda. So maybe they just happened to go to all the places that weren't accepting it. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah,
Andy and Paco, what's your guys' experience? I was thinking, well, maybe I live in a bubble. I just go to the same businesses all the time. So maybe I'm wrong. What would you guys guess as far as the number or the percentages of businesses in El Zonte that are accepting Bitcoin?
There are like 2 or 3 holdouts that are just like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not really sure. And I don't know. But when all the folks come, like right now, they got to be scratching their heads.
But 2 to 3, I mean, there's probably 100 businesses in El Zonte. I think there's more than 2 to 3. But what would you say percentage wise? Like 80, 90% of the businesses accept Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think we're pushing 90%. I think so.
Yeah.
You agree? Yeah. That was my perspective. But I always like to second guess myself because I don't go to all the businesses. I have my ones I like to go to, and those all accept Bitcoin. So maybe I was living in a bubble. But I asked my son, I was like, what do you think? Because he's out more in the community. He's like, yeah, probably 80 to 90% of the businesses accept. So now that's not saying that 80, 90% of their volume is done in Bitcoin.
Correct.
That's a different thing. So when people are talking about the level of Bitcoin acceptance, you kind of have to clarify what that is.
Yeah.
But I think also people underestimate, even at 1%, how big that is to get people to shift the way that they pay for things. Like when credit cards first came into place, it took them a long time to get to 1%. And so I think, 5 years from now, people are going to be shocked at the percentage that happens in Bitcoin. And a big part of this is just because it's so easy. I mean, it just works better. Like I always joke with my wife, she's like, I'm not a Bitcoiner. I'm like, you have done more Bitcoin transactions than the majority of speakers at a Bitcoin conference. Like
that's true.
Because it's just easy. It just works better. It's easy. It's just works. And so I think because of that, you're going to see 5 years from now, people aren't going to be talking about this anymore because it's just going to be like, people just like to do things in Bitcoin because it's easier. Yeah. But right now, that is a topic and that is a criticism that people levy on El Salvador. But I think for me, it's actually happened faster than I expected. I thought it would take much longer to get to 1%. I definitely thought it would take longer to get the 90% of stores in El Zonte. And I've been shocked that even in the last year, kind of quietly, all these stores that have started to come online, and even some of the stores that were accepting Bitcoin before, where it was a horrible experience, now it's a great experience. So it used to be, you had to have a lot of patience to actually pay in Bitcoin because, like PriceMart's an example, they only accepted on chain, and you had to wait for it to confirm. And so one time I had to wait 4 hours there for my purchase to confirm. Where now they've adopted Lightning and it actually works faster than if you're doing it on a credit card. So those are the type of things, as people realize that it's just better, that's going to drive adoption.
I think that's such an important point because, as we've said in various ways in this discussion multiple times, about how we try to price future prosperity in terms of current, or we try to look backwards in terms of current, and we have trouble understanding both the future world and the past world because we're looking at today in our lifetime. And I think the same thing was true with the internet. It's like if you were to go back 30 years, I'm sure, and me or anyone were to tell someone that, yeah, the internet's going to be so big that it's going to be like your newspaper and your cable television and your bank together times 1,000 for 10 times the people, it'd just be mind blowing. I think the same thing's true with Bitcoin, that like people look at it as like, oh, Bitcoin can't scale, or oh, this or that, or expensive, or blah, 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 blah. And I think they fail to realize that this is like dial-up stage for Bitcoin. And not just you, I'm glad you said that actually, because I say the same thing all the time. I'm shocked by how fast things are changing. I was shocked when Saylor went as hard in Bitcoin as he did. I was shocked when El Salvador announced Bitcoin as legal tender. Like, that completely surprised me, because I remember, back to my orange pill story in 2020, like, okay, maybe countries accept Bitcoin. All it was like, okay, maybe like late 2020s, I don't know. And then boom, mid 2021, first one happens. It's like, what? That just happened? And then you have everything else. Like every layer of seeing Bitcoin adoption, to me, it's happening faster, continuing than I expect. And I feel like I'm the hyperbole talking about a $300 million or $3 billion Bitcoin, right? But I'm not, but I'm just surprised by that. And then I always think in terms of rate of changes and not the change himself, right? I think to the pessimistic side again with these dollars, it's like we fail to realize the difference there. If inflation is 2% and it goes to 4%, most people think, oh, inflation is 2% worse. That's really bad. And I'm like, no, inflation is just doubled, right? The amount of destruction of the currency every year is just doubled. Okay, you go to 6%, that's triple. That's not up 4%. That's 200 or 300% or whatever, right? And it goes up perpetually from there. 10% is not a little bit worse than 6%. It's much worse. And you go to places like Argentina or South Africa or wherever, and it's 80%, 100%, or Turkey would be another great example. Another G20 country is like 80, 100, 120%. And that's exponentially worse than that. And then you go to somewhere like Venezuela or Lebanon, where it's just off the charts and it's just complete destruction. So that's the pessimistic side. But then the optimistic side is like, I've talked to people with the same criticism of here is like, oh, Bitcoin adoption is not even 1%. It's all just hype. But it's like, in 3 years, it went from 0.0001% or whatever, some silly amount of zeros, to 1%. It's like, I'm looking forward to coming back here and doing this again in a couple of years, where it's like, now we're at 6% adoption or 5%. Okay, now we're at 15%. Okay, now we're at 40%. Okay, now we're at like 80%. Right? Like I think it'll be like that, where it's like, and just like the energy,
like the internet,
like everything else, like
people
the internet,
don't understand exponentials.
Yeah,
they just don't. So they don't understand how getting to 1% often takes longer than getting from 1% to 80%. Like it is, because when you start from such a low base, and I think that is why, in some ways, older people like myself have a little bit of an advantage understanding Bitcoin's potential, because
they lived through the internet.
Lived through the internet thing. I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, this is the stupidest thing ever. It takes forever to just download I remember waiting for my email to download, like, and it failing and having to try to do it in the middle of the night so it actually work. And, you go to web pages and it was like the static thing that provided, it was just like, I don't know if this is ever really going to catch on or really be that big of a thing. And then today you look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, it was obvious that it was going to dominate the world, but I was just too stupid to understand that. So well, I think living through that, now I see the same thing with Bitcoin. And so I see, wow, this is moving faster than how I saw the internet move. And I think because it's actually money, the implications of it are even larger than the internet was for society. You called yourself stupid. I wouldn't call you stupid. I think no, it's normal. I mean, it's just human,
but it's normal. That's my whole point with the technological worldview. Is like so many Bitcoiners like, oh, you're stupid. You're still using paper money. Just idiots. And I'm like, you were the same way 18 months ago. What makes you so morally righteous, right? I mean, it's like, it's not that these people are stupid. It's just that they're if you took a Roman, again, and brought them to today, they wouldn't have a clue how to do anything. And they're probably more fit than you. In many ways, they're probably healthier than you, especially if they're younger. I mean, granted, it's like, it's like they're not stupid.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a completely different way of thinking. So anyway, I think the same thing today. I think the rate of change is true also with price, obviously adoption and everything else. But I think, I think you mentioned the upcoming cycle, and I think this is the cycle perhaps where diminishing returns either dies or is put in question. There's that chart again. But basically, it's like if thus far 4 cycles now we've seen those diminishing returns. Obviously, this hyperbolic chart is not a timeline prediction as the timeline stops, but it's just a construct, right? But I think it's like eventually that's going to happen as this as this American political currency trends to this. That's eventually going to happen, and I think when that starts to happen and people stop telling themselves, again, stories, people stop telling themselves the story of Bitcoin's far out in the risk speculation bell curve and it's extremely high risk, to when they realize Bitcoin is the only thing that's a bearer asset, not reliant on debt and this and that and the other, blah, 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 actually in my own custody without the requirement of a central third party. When they begin having that risk adjusted shift, I think that's when things start to happen and things go crazy. So yeah, so speaking of stories, to not change the topic too much, this is the movie I'm working on. I asked myself earlier this year, like, what's the best way to do this? I think a movie's really good. Lots of great books out there. There are lots of great movies. You were in Dare to Dream, which is an excellent movie. Everyone should check out Dare to Dream. It's got you and a bunch of other prominent.
Well, Graham did an amazing job with that.
Excellent.
And Joe and like
for his
everybody
first film,
involved.
incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great movie.
Off the charts.
I highly recommend that. This is not a document. Well, it is documentary, but this is basically just me trying to communicate this message about Bitcoin, again, from the technology first principles first, why Bitcoin's important in a non-mocking, non-toxic way. Because the hope is, as Bitcoin price goes up, which I think it could go up a lot, right? Bitcoin price is up 125% since last November, a year ago. 120. So right now, Bitcoin's what, 37,500 US?
Yeah.
So 125% from here is 84,000. 125% from there is 189,000. Then it's 425. Then it's like $1 million, right? So it's like, in many ways, in the last year, we've already gone a fifth, quote unquote, of the way to $1 million. And so my point is, as that happens, there's going to be so much distraction to the crypto stuff, to all that. And so I want, whether it's my movie or not, I want content out there that's visually engaging, meeting people where they are, visually stimulating in the world of low attention span internet culture. Meet people where they are, explain the message, and hopefully be an efficient way of helping people, again, think that story and then beginning asking the question, wait, what if Bitcoin isn't this high risk thing? What if it's low risk? And what if volatility is not a bad thing, but actually in terms of an increasing volatile currency, you require volatility? What if they start asking these things? So anyway, that's the movie. We raised 37 million sats. Oh boy.
That you should not.
Are we going to watch it? Or
what if the future is
great.
built atop of technology that
I filmed this
fundamentally
on
changes
my
an underlying
iPhone,
building
not
block
the
of
best
society,
quality,
Okay.
but
and we're completely oblivious to it? What if Bitcoin, despite our human intuition, actually has the possibility to change the world as we know it, to change our energy production, to change how we think about money, to change our economics, to change our policy, to change our government structure, to change every facet of human life in ways that we can't even understand?
Yeah, so we
What
won't
is
watch the whole
Bitcoin?
thing for those
Is it once-
that are just listening online. But I think you said that you're in post-production on it already.
yeah, we're post-production. We're
Okay.
moving along. The goal is to have it done early next year.
Okay.
Originally, we haven't reached our fundraising goal. So like I said, I recorded this like on my iPhone, like super zero budget, to aid the larger message. Like, we're only raising $20,000 for this film, which
Okay.
in film
Yeah,
making,
in the film world, that's
and
nothing.
filmmaking speak, that's like an afternoon's budget,
Yeah.
right? It's basically nothing.
Yeah.
But to me, I was facing the question: okay, do I spend a year fundraising to then get the message out and raise 200 grand, or do I just do it now, low budget, bootstraps, 20 grand? And I think that's the more important thing. I think that agility speed is really important.
So you need like half a Bitcoin. That's what
Yeah. And I mean, we're almost there. We've already raised 40,000 or next 40 million sats. Because guys, there's most of the sats, not all of them though. Robert Breedlove's a producer of the film, so
Okay.
I'm really excited about
Awesome.
that. That was a huge boost that he believed in me that much and believed in the project that much. But the long term hope is that the film goes out. It's gonna screen in Sydney at Bitcoin Alive next year, or at least that's the hope. And then after that, Hopefully in Europe there'll be a little European premiere, and then in Canada too next year, hopefully. So hopefully it'll have a bunch of good screenings, and not just for the Bitcoiners that already get the message.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, it is for the Bitcoiners that get the message, because I think Bitcoiners that already are Bitcoiners, all of us, myself included, need to improve the storytelling skills. So hopefully this is useful for them to increase their efficiency at sharing the orange pill, and then likewise for the Bitcoin newbies, hopefully helps there. So the hopes that, million views, 2% success rate. If there's 20,000 new Bitcoiners from this and $20,000 budget, then $100 donation, 100 orange pills. That's the hope anyway. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to justify my time on it. But
so people can donate on Geyser.
Yeah. They can donate on Geyser. That would be great.
Just the case for Bitcoin.
The case for Bitcoin. You'll see my name on it, and a bunch of really generous people and believers of mine supporting that, which means the world to me. I wouldn't be here on this trip if it weren't for people donating and supporting me to come on these trips. Not separate from the film, obviously, but it just means the world that people believe in me, and I'm always happy to volunteer and do what I can to advance that. So yeah, that's the main content thing I'm working on. Always, of course. The other thing that's more recent than that too is I joined the Bitcoin Advisor. I don't know if you know the Bitcoin Advisor.
No.
It's out of Australia. It's Peter Dunworth's company.
Okay.
And I'm really excited for that because basically, so what we do at the Bitcoin Advisor is we do multisig custody for folks. We help people set up their vaults. We help people do estate planning and everything like that. So right now, this year, Peter's had this company for 7 years, never lost a single cent for any client ever. And finally, he went international this year. So it's been a blast to work with him and have so many people, whether it's 1 coin, 100 coins. We have people of all net worths that finally get their coins off exchange. I tell people my job literally now is helping people take their Bitcoins off Coinbase, right? That's my job, right? People that have the intimidation, again, stories we tell ourselves, we're scared of self-custody. The Bitcoin Advisor helps people take that self-custody. And, obviously I'm talking about this, but I think it's really important whether they do it with us or on their own. It's more important they just do it, right? Because I think, like we're saying, exponentials, I see it with my work and everyone else, it's happening so fast that people are taking them off exchanges. So that's right now the business. And on a personal note, I know you're a Christian, but something I'm really excited for is that, right now we're busier than we can handle. We're trying to scale as quick as we can for the individuals, but I'm excited in 2 years from now, when churches and mission organizations and people that are looking to have these global impacts, and, when those companies, corporations, and charities begin getting into Bitcoin, they'll need multisig. And so it's a thrill to be at that company and helping build those things, because my vision obviously is for people. Now the main urgency is helping individuals get their coins off exchanges and get their multisig vaults setting up. But because that's in light of what we all know is coming in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, all these churches, Christian, secular, whatever, corporate, charitable, all these organizations are going to need multisig. And so that was my talk at Adopting Bitcoin about Bitcoin aligning incentives. It's I love it. I hope that this business does well and that my work does in the film. I hope all these things do well and benefit me. But it's I just, as a Christian, it's just so thrilling to think that, wow, what if me and dozens, hopefully hundreds of other people lead the charge, and we help all these institutions and charities adopt Bitcoin, number one, and number two, have real Bitcoin in their own vaults and don't first go through the ETF or paper Bitcoin rabbit hole and lose their coins. So those are the two things I'm working on. I'm working on the film, and I'm working on the Bitcoin Advisor.
So just kind of tagging on to that, I don't know if I mentioned it to you or not, but over the next couple of days, we have a big group coming down for the preliminary workshops for this new venture that's called Gresham Ventures.
Yeah, Gresham Ventures. Yeah, for Think of Bitcoin. I was at their announcement. In
okay, LA. Yeah, that's right. So Jimmy's coming down, Jimmy Song, and a bunch of the other guys that were authors of Thank God for Bitcoin, and then they've invited other Christians that are in the space, and it's kind of preliminary. We're bringing some missionaries in to just kind of show how Bitcoin can be used in the context of the work that they're doing, similar to some of the stuff that's happened here at Bitcoin Beach. But then also, a lot of the places that they work, it's just challenging getting funds into in general. And I personally believe it's going to be very important for the church to adopt Bitcoin, because I think that's the way the government's going to try to censor them. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we're going to see that increasingly. We saw that with the truckers in Canada,
Yeah.
and we're starting to see different churches get cut off from their banking rails in the U.S., and I think that's going to just accelerate in the near future. So I think it is important that, for these organizations that we believe are playing an important role, that they are not tied to the censorable money, that they have, censorship resistant money to be able to fund things and to run on. So
I
we'll have to follow up with you
Yeah.
on that, and looking for other people to get involved with this. And
Yeah.
I'm not the one running it, but I said, hey, well, let's have it here, and
I know,
let's it's exciting to see that they want to do it. Started in El Salvador and what they're doing. So we'll be making more announcements on that going forward.
And
So.
that's my favorite thing about being in the space is hanging out with people like you, like these guys, other, you three are like the first 3 Bitcoiners in the first circular Bitcoin economy in the world. It's like, that's pretty cool, right? I just love hanging out with you all, meeting you all, networking with you all. It's like, there's just so many of us now. It's growing so quick. And just to think like, wow, hopefully if we're right, every single person, both here and then also listening online is probably going to be a really important influence in the monetary world in the future, right? If we're at 0.1% adoption globally, it's like every person listening to this podcast, when it comes out has significant Bitcoin exposure, it's like you're the top 1 in 1,000 people probably understands Bitcoin. It's like, number one, you should take self-custody because there's 999 people after you, and a lot of them will be willing to pay the transaction fees and pay for, Multisig or whatever services. But number two, it's really important because you can have an impact on your community. And so anyway, I know I'm getting kind of preachy here, but it's like, really, it's like you've had an impact on your community. I mean, people all the time at these conferences come up to me and give me these emotional stories about how I've changed their life or whatever. And I'm like, it's moving because I feel like I've done nothing. I've just tweeted a bunch and made YouTube videos, and I get to do this. It's like, is this work? I mean, it is work. It's all day, every day. But anyway, point being that like, I think every person has a voice. Again, Bitcoin adoption, I think, comes as a function of stories, and every person has an individual story that they can use to share with other individuals. So, it's a pleasure. I love it.
Perfect. Well, we could talk all night, but we have a Bitcoin meetup to get to. But I want to make sure people know where they can follow you, how they can support your film initiatives. Make sure we'll put that in the show notes. But please let them know.
If you want to follow me on social, you can find me on Twitter or YouTube. If you want to support the film, you can find it on Geyser at The Case for Bitcoin. And then I would argue,
and they just look by your name.
Yeah, just my name,
Okay.
Luke Broyles, Broyles. And then it's not on the screen here, but Luke at the Bitcoin Advisor or thebitcoinadvisor.com. You can find me on there. You can book a meeting with me, and whether you're a person, individual, multi-sig vault, estate plan, cloud custody, all that, all that's really important. So I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate everyone listening. So
this has been great. That's been great. Getting to know you. I kind of knew you peripherally, but to be able to sit down and have this conversation, see how many touch points and ideals that we share, even though I'm twice your age, it's been a blast. So appreciate it.
Thanks.